At exactly 3 a.m., 5-year-old Elliot walked to the basement door, silent, barefoot, eyes wide, and whispered, "I hear you." No one else heard the scratching. No one believed the cold breath behind the wall was real. But when he drew, the German shepherd curled in the dark, terrified, wounded, waiting. His parents finally followed. What they uncovered behind the crumbling concrete would shatter everything they thought they knew. This isn't just a rescue. It's a haunting, a miracle, a message from the forgotten. Why did Elliot draw a dog he had never seen? And how did he already know her name was Luna? It was early autumn, the kind where the mist still clung to the dirt roads like breath that hadn't yet let go. Pine trees rustled softly overhead, whispering in a language only the wind understood. That morning, the Reyes family drove slowly through the forest trail that led to their new home. A 2-story wooden house tucked at the very end of Pine Brook Hollow. The house looked tired. Its roof wore a thin veil of moss, the porch steps bent like crooked fingers, and the paint on the railing had long surrendered to time. But to Clara Reyes, the mother, this place wasn't worn out. It was a beginning, a clean slate. She unpacked with a quiet joy, stopping every few minutes to admire the wide wooden windows, already imagining lavender pots on the porch and tiny warm lights strung across the upstairs balcony like stars waiting to be lit. Thomas, her husband, let out a heavy sigh as he pulled boxes from the truck bed. The kind of sigh that carried more than road dust, the cost of the move, the weight of decisions, the quiet ache of trying to hold everything together. His forehead wore a crease that hadn't left in days. And Elliot, their 5-year-old son, stood behind the truck, silent, holding a pale blue stuffed animal that looked like it had been hugged too many times to hold its shape. He didn't run around or explore like kids usually do when they arrive somewhere new. He just stared, eyes locked on the attic. There was a window up there, a small half-moon pane tucked beneath the roof. The wind pushed against it gently, making it knock. Once, then again. Tap, tap, tap. He didn't speak, but something in his gaze was still and deep, like he was listening, not with his ears, but with something quieter, something older. Inside, the house felt bigger than it looked. The hallway stretched long, its pinewood floors letting out soft creaks under every step. The scent of old timber mixed with faded paint, and the early chill of autumn drifted through the cracks near the doorframes like a quiet visitor. Elliot walked with his crayon box in hand, his steps soft. He stopped at the end of the hall, in front of a door. It was heavy, wooden, the kind that doesn't just open, it resists. A basement door. He reached out and touched the knob. It was cold, rusted. He didn't turn it. Just stood there, hand resting on the metal. A sudden draft swept up from the floor, slipping beneath his shirt collar. It made him flinch. "Sweetheart," Clara called from upstairs. "Your room's on the left, near the stairs. It's got a window facing the pines. You'll love it." Elliot didn't reply. He turned his head slightly, eyes still on the door, like he'd almost heard something, almost caught it, a whisper that barely existed. He wasn't like other kids. He didn't laugh easily. He rarely cried. He liked quiet, preferred cats over people. One time, a preschool teacher wrote down that Elliot may have emotional regulation challenges because he didn't play group games and often drew strange things, like a hand reaching out from a wall or a shadow sitting beside him while he slept. But Elliot didn't draw to scare anyone. He drew because it was the only way he knew how to show what he felt. And what he felt in this house wasn't welcome. It was something heavier. A silence that didn't just fill space. It tried to speak. That night, their first in the new home, the sky let down a soft, steady rain. Wind slipped through the seams in the walls, brushing the trees outside until their branches tapped against the window in slow, steady rhythms, like someone knocking. Gently. Repeatedly. Elliot lay in bed, blanket pulled up to his chest. He held his stuffed animal close, the way you hold a secret. His eyes stayed open in the dark. Something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. A sound. Low. Barely there. A moan, maybe. A murmur. Something that came from below the floorboards. It didn't sound like the wind, or water, or the old cat. It sounded like something trying to call out, but too weak to make a sound. A moan, soft as breath, rose from beneath the floorboards. Not the cat, not pipes, not the wind. It sounded like someone trying to call out, but too weak to finish the plea. Elliot sat up. No scream. No cry for help. He stepped down onto the cold wood, barefoot, like he was walking into something sacred. Something only he was allowed to feel. He moved toward the hallway, the wind brushing past the old windows. But the sound didn't come from there. It came from the left, from the basement. He reached the door again, placed his hand on the brass handle, cold and stiff. The sound stopped. Everything went still, like whatever had been crying out suddenly realized it wasn't alone anymore, that someone had heard it. Elliot didn't open the door. He just stood there, hand resting on the knob, not blinking, not breathing too loud. Then, after a while, he turned away. Quiet steps back down the hall. Right before entering his room, he paused, looked back, not scared, not confused, just listening. The next morning, Clara found him in the living room, sitting on the floor, hunched over a cushion with his crayons. He was drawing, focused, steady, quiet. It was a dog. Curled up tightly, its stomach pressed to the ground like it was trying to disappear, its fur matted, dirty, eyes wide open, terrified, desperate, and behind it, a cracked concrete wall. Clara frowned. "Sweetheart, what are you drawing?" Elliot didn't answer right away. He was still shading in the smallest sliver of light in the dog's eyes. Just a thin line of silver, faint as a fading breath. "A dog?" Clara chuckled. "There's no dog in this house." She turned back towards the stove, flipping eggs in the pan. Thomas sat at the table, newspaper in hand, reading about gas prices, a missing person near the river. His eyes didn't lift from the page. Elliot put the crayon down. His fingers were dusted in graphite. He didn't smile, didn't look up. Just whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't draw it because I saw it. I drew it because I heard it." No one said anything. Only the sound of the pan sizzling, the faint smell of weak coffee rising in the kitchen. Elliot stayed where he was, small, quiet, and unseen in a world of grown-up noise that didn't listen to anything it didn't already understand. That night, after tucking him in, Clara stood at his door for a long while, watching the stillness, the way his hands clung to the worn blue toy, the way his eyes didn't fully close, even in sleep. Then, slowly, she stepped away and pulled the door nearly shut, leaving just a sliver of space, just in case something or someone still needed to be heard. "Do you ever think Elliot's different?" Clara's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Thomas didn't look up from his book. "He's just a kid. You're overthinking." "I don't know, Tom. He keeps drawing that dog, over and over, and did you notice the wall in the picture? It looks just like the basement." Thomas paused. He didn't answer right away, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, but I think it's just his imagination. kids draw weird stuff all the time. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. Or maybe the move is affecting him more than we thought. Outside their door, just on the other side of the wall, Elliot sat curled up with his knees pulled to his chest, his ear pressed gently to the wooden paneling. He heard every word. He didn't cry, but his eyes dimmed a little. In his hands was a blank sheet of paper. Nothing drawn yet, but in his mind, the image was already there. The same dog, curled in the dark. Only this time, there was a thin trail of blood at its paw. Rain had started, soft, steady drops tapping against the rusted tin roof. The house held its breath again. The wind passed through the attic window with a faint sigh. Somewhere inside, something shifted. Elliot's eyes opened. He didn't know why he'd woken up, but something was different tonight. Quieter and clearer. Then it came, scratch. A pause. Scratch again. Barely audible, claws, on tile, weak, slow but steady. Elliot rose from bed, silent as shadow, bare feet against cold wood. He didn't turn on the light, didn't make a sound, just followed the pull down the stairs. Alone. Unseen. The basement door waited for him, still pulled just slightly ajar. He stepped closer, placed his palm gently on the wooden surface, then leaned in, pressing his ear against it. And there it was again, so faint, so fragile. A trembling breath, not a sound exactly, but the shape of one, a living sound, a hurting sound, a sound asking to be heard. Elliot closed his eyes, whispered softly, so soft it barely moved the air. "I hear you, but why can't they?" Silence answered back. But Elliot didn't move. His hand stayed against the door, his chest rising and falling, not from fear, but something closer to sorrow. From that day forward, Elliot drew every single day. No one told him to, no one truly understood. But for him, each line was a clue, each color a signal. And the drawing was the only way he knew how to keep the connection alive, with something no one else believed was real. In Elliot's drawing, the dog was lying on its side. One leg bent unnaturally, a wound sketched faintly at the joint. Its eyes were wide open, its mouth barely parted as if caught mid-whimper. Around it, he'd drawn narrow bricks, cracks in the wall, small slits just wide enough to let in a single thread of light. He used no color, just pencil, just shades of black. "Because there's no color there," Elliot said when Clara asked him why. Her concern grew each day. There was something about the drawings that unsettled her, not because they were dark, but because they felt too real. She scheduled a meeting with the school psychologist. The woman was older, kind, with a quiet voice. She spent nearly half an hour sitting with Elliot, looking through his sketches, asking soft questions. When she returned to Clara, she spoke gently. "Elliot is very sensitive, not disordered, but he has a kind of perception that doesn't follow the usual paths." "You mean he hears things that aren't real?" "Not quite. I think he's hearing something, just not in the way we understand hearing." That night, Elliot quietly pulled out the first drawing, the one of the dog curled up in the shadows. He placed it on the small table right outside the basement door. Beside it, he left a single cookie. Untouched. He didn't say a word. Didn't wait for anything. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't a game. It was something simpler, like a message, a comfort, a silent promise. Before going to bed, Elliot looked back at the wall one more time. There was no fear in his eyes. No doubt. Only the quiet look of someone who knew If the whole world stopped believing, he'd still be the one who stayed. If I'm the only one who can hear it, he thought, then I'll be the only one who doesn't walk away. That night, something woke him. The wall clock clicked exactly to 3 a.m. He didn't turn on the light. Sweat traced a path down his temple, and the back of his pajama shirt clung to damp skin. But it wasn't fear, not entirely. His dream had felt different this time. It wasn't made of fog or nonsense or jumbled images. It was sound. Cold, echoing sound. The room in the dream had walls slick with moss, and the stench of damp concrete filled his lungs. It was pitch black. But through that dark, he heard it, breathing. Shallow, fragile, like someone clinging to the edge of life, one breath at a time. Then a scratch. Just one. But sharp enough to pull him upright in bed. He remembered reaching out in the dream, pressing his hand against a wall. And on the other side, something collapsed. There had been a whimper, not from pain, from surrender. Elliot sat up in the real world. Rain tapped against the windows. The wind whistled through the cracks in the attic beams. But inside him, there was something different. A strange warmth, steady in his chest. As if a moment had come. Something he could no longer ignore. Something he was ready for. It wasn't like a normal dream. No floating images, no unfinished stories. It was sound, clear, cold, real. In the dream, the room was freezing. His hands burned from the chill. The walls were slick with moss, and the smell of mold clung thick in the air, sharp and wet. Everything was darkness, thick, heavy. But through it, he heard it. Breathing, so faint it barely registered. But steady. Like someone fighting for each inhale, holding on to life one breath at a time. Then a scratch. Just one. But it cut through the dark like a scream. When he touched the wall, he felt something on the other side fall. Collapse. And a low whimper followed, small, broken, like something giving up. Elliot shot up in bed. Rain beat down on the roof. The wind howled through the cracks in the old attic walls. But inside him, something felt warm. Alive. Not fear, not confusion. Something else. The sense that now was the time. He got up. Didn't call for anyone. He didn't need to. Because somehow his father already knew. Thomas looked at his son's face, pale but calm, serious in that quiet way only Elliot could be, and without a word, turned back into the tool shed. Moments later, he returned with a sledgehammer and a crowbar. This wasn't a game anymore. He walked to the basement wall, looked at it for a long second, then raised the hammer. The first hit was light, a warning. Dust floated up, clouding the air. The crack spread. And then, a sound. This time, no mistaking it. A short, ragged cry. Faint, but real. Elliot backed up, gripping the hem of his father's shirt. Thomas's arms tightened. He struck again, then again. Chunks of cement began to break away, crumbling to the cold floor. Slowly, a hollow opened. Narrow. Black as pitch. A smell pushed out, rot and rust, old metal and damp air. Thomas stopped, raised the flashlight. And there, 2 eyes, blinking in the dark. A dog, curled tight, its fur soaked in mud, dried blood, and its own waste. Sunken cheeks, ribs sharp beneath thin skin. One of its back legs was twisted unnaturally, broken, unmoving. But the eyes? The eyes still held light. Thomas staggered back, Not from fear, from disbelief. How did you know?" he whispered, not even sure who he was asking. Elliot stepped forward. He knelt, slowly reached his hand toward the opening. "I didn't know," he said softly. "I heard." The dog didn't bark, didn't struggle. It just breathed and stared at Elliot like it had been waiting for him. Elliot didn't pet it. He simply placed his fingertips near its nose, and then a lick, barely there. Trembling, but enough. Enough for them both to understand. "You found me." Thomas knelt too, pulled off his scarf, and gently wrapped it around the frail creature. He cradled it in his arms like a child, lifting it carefully from the darkness. Its body felt too light, hollow, like it had emptied everything just to keep breathing long enough to be seen. Elliot stepped closer, looked at the dog's face, and whispered one word. Luna. That name had never been spoken aloud, but Elliot knew. He didn't need a reason. The dog closed her eyes. For the first time, she could rest. Luna was gently laid on a thick blanket in the kitchen. Outside, the rain kept falling. The house was still cold, but something new had started to warm from within. Elliot sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on her neck, feeling each shallow breath rise and fall like fading waves. His father sat just a few steps away, his hands still trembling. He didn't speak. He didn't look away. 15 minutes later, the vet arrived. She listened to the story, then looked at Luna. Her expression shifted. This dog shouldn't be alive," she said, quietly stunned. But Elliot didn't move, didn't flinch. The noise of the world had faded. Right now, all that mattered was her. Before they took Luna for treatment, she looked up at him one last time. No more panic, no more fear, only trust, only the look of someone who had finally been seen. Elliot leaned close, whispering again, as if sealing something sacred. "I'm not leaving. Not ever." Later that night, Elliot was dreaming again. He was running, fast, breathless, but he didn't know where from or where to. Ahead stretched a narrow hallway, no windows, no light, just cold concrete, wet air, and a feeling in his chest that he wasn't alone. His steps slowed. The air thickened, heavy like wet cloth pressing against his face. Every breath he took tasted like mold and dust. And then, a sound. A moan. Quiet. Strangled. Like a cry trying to escape a throat that couldn't open. It wasn't human. It wasn't wind. It was pain. Living pain. He pressed his ear against the wall. A faint scraping. Claws. Dragging slowly over cement. The rhythm matched his heartbeat. Then it faded. He laid his hand flat on the wall. And for a second, it felt like the wall was breathing. A sigh followed. Not his. Weary. Worn out. Then, silence. Elliot jolted awake. His shirt was soaked in sweat, his hands cold. The room was dark. Rain tapped softly at the window pane. But he wasn't afraid. He sat up, looked toward the basement stairs, and whispered to the silence, "If we wait any longer, it'll be too late." He didn't turn on the lights. He walked slowly down the hallway, stopped outside his parents' room, pushed the door open and stepped in, laid a hand on his father's shoulder, gently shook him. "Dad, I need you. Now." Thomas stirred, grumbled something half asleep, annoyed. "Can't it wait till morning?" But when he opened his eyes, Elliot was standing still, silent, not crying, not shaking, Just calm. Steady, that same look. The kind that only shows up when you've been waiting your whole life to say one thing, and now the moment has come. Thomas sat up. Didn't question. He reached for his coat and followed his son downstairs. They didn't turn on the lights. Only a single flashlight in Elliot's hand. Its narrow beam lit the old steps, one at a time, as they creaked beneath their feet. No words passed between them. At the bottom, Elliot stopped. Before the same wall. He placed his hand on the concrete and said softly, "Listen, it's breathing." Thomas frowned, but leaned down anyway, pressed his ear to the wall, just to prove there was nothing there. At first, only the drip of rain outside. But then, a sound. Small. Wet. A sniffle. Then a scrape. Barely there. But there. Fingernails, or claws, dragging across stone. Thomas straightened, looked at his son. Elliot didn't explain, didn't plead. He just looked back, eyes steady, not asking for belief, just offering a truth, waiting to be seen. Thomas turned without a word. Minutes later, he returned. Hammer, crowbar, floodlight. No more hesitation, no more questions. He tapped the wall, testing. The echo was hollow. He tightened his grip. Elliot held his breath. Each blow landed like a heartbeat, heavy, deep, unstoppable. Then it came. A moan, not loud, but alive. Thomas struck harder. The plaster cracked. Chunks of cement fell away. A small opening broke through just enough for the light to reach inside. Beyond the wall, a narrow chamber, damp, rotten, the stench of rust, of fear, of days long forgotten. And then eyes, shining in the dark. Amber eyes, waiting. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. She just looked, straight at Elliot, not with fear but with recognition. Thomas staggered back, breath caught in his throat. How did you know?" he whispered. "How did you even—" Elliot stepped closer. He didn't answer right away. Just said quietly, "I heard her days ago, but I didn't understand until now." Still, the dog didn't move. Couldn't lift her head. But her eyes never left him. Elliot reached forward, slowly, hand outstretched until it hovered near her nose. The dog sniffed, then licked his fingertip, barely a touch, but enough to catch in Elliot's chest like a breath he forgot to take. "I knew it," he whispered. "You've been waiting a long time." Thomas knelt beside the hole in the wall, carefully wrapping his arms through the narrow gap. He slid a scarf under her frail body, lifting her as gently as if she were made of paper. Luna didn't resist. Her ribs showed sharp beneath matted fur, but she still tried, just barely, to hold her head up, as if refusing to fall in front of Elliot. Elliot placed a hand on her head, warm and steady. "Your name's Luna, isn't it?" They carried her to the kitchen. Thomas spread out an old blanket on the floor. Luna was laid on top, curled up softly, her body too thin, too quiet. Elliot sat beside her, legs crossed. Her head rested on his lap. Her breathing was shallow but steady. His hand stayed gently on her neck. Not stroking, not petting. Just holding. As if his hand alone could keep her heart beating. Thomas stood a few feet away, phone in hand. He'd called the vet already. Now he just stood there, watching them. No more disbelief, no more trying to explain it. Only silence, and something that felt like truth. The vet arrived quickly, an older woman in a raincoat still soaked from the storm. She stopped in the doorway and froze. "This," she whispered. This is a miracle. Before she could be taken for treatment, Luna looked up at Elliot one last time. Her eyes no longer wide with fear, just soft, grateful. Elliot leaned in, lips close to her ear. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured. "Never." Behind him, Thomas stood still. He didn't speak, but for the first time, his eyes truly listened to his son, not with worry, not with questions, but with his heart. The vet knelt beside Luna, examining her inch by inch with quiet care. She checked her eyes, lifted an ear, pressed gently along her legs, her ribs, the spine that showed too clearly through her skin. But Luna didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Her head stayed on Elliot's lap. Her eyes stayed on his face. Elliot stroked her neck slowly, one gentle motion at a time. He didn't ask questions, didn't wonder where she came from or how long she had suffered. Because something in those amber eyes told him everything he needed to know, something unspoken and ancient, like a memory they both carried. Thomas watched from a short distance. He didn't interrupt, didn't call his son back. He just sat, quietly witnessing something he had never seen before in Elliot. Not imagination, not a child's game, but presence, a connection deeper than words. The vet let out a breath. "Her heart's weak," she said, "but her organs are stable. Severe dehydration, dangerous weight loss, malnourished. But if she makes it through the next 48 hours, she has a real chance." Elliot nodded, calm. "I know Luna will live." No one had told him that name. There was no collar, no tag. But it wasn't a guess. It wasn't a name he chose. It was something he heard, not with ears, but with something else. Something deeper. And Luna didn't react to the name like it was new. When Elliot whispered it again, "Luna," her ear twitched, her eyes opened wider, and her tail, frail as it was, moved, just once. That night, for the first time in years, Elliot slept straight through. His room glowed softly with warm yellow light from a lamp on the desk. Luna lay beside his bed, head resting on an old cushion lined with fresh towels. Next to her sat a bowl of water and the soft food the vet had left behind. Elliot lay curled on his side, facing her. His arm hung over the edge of the bed, fingers just barely brushing the fur behind her ear. No words passed between them, but the rain outside slowed to a whisper, and the rhythm of their breathing gently matched. At one point, Luna stirred. Her body shivered slightly. Elliot opened his eyes for a moment. He didn't sit up, just smiled, ran his fingers lightly over the top of her head, then closed his eyes again. No nightmares, no cold sweat, just peace. And by morning, as the first light slipped past the curtains, Luna was awake. The dog didn't sit up, but her eyes opened wider, her nose lifted slightly, sniffing the air, as if trying to memorize this new place, this soft light, this quiet peace. Elliot was still asleep. His breathing slow and even. His hand rested just inches from Luna's paw. Not quite touching, but close enough that you could feel the connection between them. At the doorway, Thomas stood holding a cup of coffee. He didn't come in, just stood there, still, watching. Something caught in his chest, a feeling he hadn't prepared for. Something that felt strange, but familiar. His son. The boy who used to hide under blankets, who feared the dark, who once froze at the sight of even the gentlest animals. Now asleep beside a dog that had been trapped behind a wall. And somehow, the two of them, boy and dog, fear and silence, were healing one another. Later that afternoon, Elliot sat down with a blank sheet of paper. He didn't draw the house, didn't draw the trees or the rain. He drew a pair of eyes. Luna's eyes. Amber. Layered. Alive. He used only pencil, pressing hard into the page to bring out the light caught in her gaze. He spent over 30 minutes just shaping the iris, darkening the curves where the light danced back. Careful. Patient. Present. When it was done, he placed the drawing on the table, then quietly returned to sit beside her. "I drew you," he whispered, running his fingers gently down her spine. "So they'll know you're real, not something buried behind a wall." Luna didn't bark, didn't move. She just looked at him. And in her stillness, there was more truth than any word could carry. You know, sometimes kids see what adults forget to look for. That morning, Elliot sat quietly by the window, the soft hum of the wind slipping past the glass. His hand rested gently on Luna's back, tracing the length of her spine like he was memorizing it. "I drew you," he whispered, eyes focused, voice barely more than a breath. "So people would know you're alive, not buried behind some wall." Luna didn't bark. She didn't even move much, just looked at him. That kind of look that holds everything, all the fear, all the pain, all the memories that couldn't be spoken. But also something else, a clear presence, a quiet knowing, like she understood she was finally being seen. Elliot leaned in, pressing his cheek gently against Luna's forehead. Her breathing was still heavy, but steady, and even though he couldn't hear a heartbeat with his ears, he felt it in his chest. A rhythm. Real. Present. That night, Elliot slept beside her again. Everything in the room was the same. The little lamp in the corner, the wind whispering outside the window, the soft steps of his father passing in the hallway now and then. But the dream was different. There was no dark hallway, no cold wall pressing in, just water. A deep black river, no moonlight, no clear shore, the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. In the dream, Elliot wasn't seeing it with his eyes. He was smelling it, thick, wet, iron-heavy air, the stench of rot. But also something urgent. Alive. He heard a sound, not loud, but sharp, a soft, wet cry, like something, someone, trying not to drown. Gasping. Failing. Then he saw it. A shipping container. Rust red. Tilted sideways, half submerged near the river's edge. Inside, eyes. Then more eyes. And more. Dogs. Packed together. Silent. Not barking. Just looking. Eyes like little flames in a storm. Faint, flickering, desperate. The container had no door. Welded shut. No way out. No one knew. No one heard. Except Elliot. He woke up soaked in sweat. Back drenched, breath shallow. But he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He sat up and turned toward Luna. She was already awake, staring at him. "You saw it too, didn't you?" he asked. Luna didn't move, but her tail flicked. Just once. Software. Almost like a whisper, and that was enough. Elliot knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a memory. But not his. The next morning he grabbed a pencil and began to draw. Not Luna's eyes this time, but the container, every detail he could remember. The rust, the markings, even the dust on the metal. His father walked in and stood behind him, quiet. "What are you drawing?" he asked gently. "I'm not sure," Elliot replied, not turning around. "But I think this place is real." His dad didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Because ever since Luna arrived, Elliot had changed. The fear had faded. The silence had softened. And every word he spoke, every line he drew, came from somewhere true. 3 nights in a row, Elliot dreamed the same dream. Same river, same smell, same container. But on the 3rd night, something new. A white stripe, like paint, near the edge of the water. And a number. Faint but readable, etched into the metal like it had waited to be remembered. COSI 2739B. Elliot jumped up from bed and scribbled it down, then ran to the living room. His father sat reading the paper. Luna curled up by the fire, half asleep. "Dad, I need to look something up." His father handed him the phone without a word. Elliot typed the code. KC 2739B. It took a few minutes. Then, something popped up. It was a real shipping code, registered under an industrial transport lot, part of a closed investigation. Westport Dock, just under 60 miles from where they lived. Case closed 5 years ago. His father looked up, eyes narrowing. "Where'd you find this?" "In a dream," Elliot said. No one spoke for a while, just the crackle of fire. That afternoon, they drove to the vet. Elliot brought the drawing. The vet looked at it, then at Luna. Her usual gentle smile faded. "A few years ago," she said quietly, "there was a case. Dozens of dogs locked in abandoned containers near Black Ridge River. Most were gone by the time they got there. Smuggled out, only a few were saved." Elliot just nodded, because he already knew. It was there. Half buried in the mud, tangled in weeds, rusted deep from years of silence. A red container. Tilted, almost swallowed by the earth, like the river had been trying to keep its secret. Elliot stepped closer. The air felt heavier here, thick with something that wasn't just moisture or rot. It was memory, pressed into the soil, sealed in the steel. Luna didn't bark. She just stood still, her eyes fixed on the container, her body low, as if every nerve remembered what had happened here. Her breathing changed, slower, deeper, not afraid, but remembering. Elliot knelt down and ran his fingers along the metal. The paint flaked off at the touch, but beneath the grime, the numbers were still there, faint but readable. KC 2739B. His heart skipped, not from fear, but from recognition. It was real. This was the place. He looked back at Luna. She was staring at the door, the way someone might stare at a grave they never got to visit. Not with anger, not even with sorrow. Just quiet truth. She walked toward it, nose to the ground, stopping only when she reached a patch of earth at the corner. She started to paw at the dirt, slow, gentle, as if the act itself was sacred. Elliot didn't stop her. He stood beside her and looked out at the water. The same water from his dreams. Black Ridge River, winding like an old scar across the land. Still, wide, watching. He didn't speak, because there was nothing to say. This place wasn't waiting for words. It was waiting for someone to come back. Someone to remember. Luna lay down, pressing her side against the rusted door. And Elliot understood. It wasn't just about finding the past. It was about naming it, witnessing it, letting the silence know it had been heard. He took out his notebook, opened to a blank page, and began to draw. The container. The curve of the river. The shape of Luna's body resting there like she belonged to this earth. The sky above started to shift. Gray opening into a soft kind of light. Not bright, but warm in its own way. Elliot closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in. The scent of old steel, damp leaves, fading fear. And something new. Hope. Not loud or fast, but steady. Like a heartbeat. And somewhere, In the stillness, a quiet promise was made, not in words, not in vows, but in the space between one breath and the next. They wouldn't forget. They wouldn't leave what was lost behind. Not again. Not this time. A rust-red container. Tilted sideways, half sunk between the muddy bank and the edge of the river. Part of it hidden under wild, overgrown grass. K. C2739B. The numbers were still there, barely visible, stamped into the edge of the steel door. Elliot moved closer, each step pounding louder in his chest. Luna stayed right beside him, her eyes never leaving the container. When Elliot laid his hand against the cold metal, a jolt passed through him, like he had just touched someone else's memory. The door was welded shut, but near the edge, a patch of rust had eaten away just enough space for a finger to slip in. Elliot reached into his backpack and pulled out the small carving knife he used on old planks of wood. He wedged it into the gap, twisted, pried. The metal groaned. Bits cracked and broke. Each sharp clang rang out like the echo of a cry, one that had once begged not to be forgotten. Finally, the door gave way. Just a little. Not wide enough to open. Just enough to let the light slip in, and the smell hit them. Wet. Rotten. Old in a way nothing should ever be. Elliot flicked on his flashlight and pointed it inside. No movement, no life. But there were traces. Paw prints, scratch marks, tufts of fur clinging to the corners. Behind him, Luna didn't move forward. She let out a low, quiet whine, a sound soaked in something deeper than fear. Sadness, a kind that didn't need words. Elliot turned to her. I know. I see it too. This is the place. No one needed to confirm it. No one needed to believe him. Elliot knew, Luna knew, and everything inside that rusted container knew too. She wasn't trapped anymore. But someone else might be. Elliot pulled out a piece of paper from his notebook. He taped it to the inside of the container door, where no one could miss it. A rough line written in pencil. This was once a prison, but it's also proof. If someone is still out there, I'll find them. He placed his hand gently on Luna's head. You survived to tell this story. Now it's my turn. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the dry leaves. And then Elliot heard something. A sound so faint it almost disappeared between gusts. A bark. Far away. Fragile. Cracked. Not from Luna, but from somewhere deeper. Deeper into the woods. He froze. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a broken sound, half whimper, half bark. Not the wild cry of an animal, not the echo of the forest. It was a call, a plea. Luna's ears perked. She turned to Elliot, let out a soft grunt, then stepped forward. Not running, but certain. Elliot followed without a word. The ground was soft and wet beneath them, soaked from old rain. The forest ahead closed in quickly, branches tangling above like a woven roof. The light faded. The deeper they went, the more the path seemed to blur into darkness. But Luna didn't hesitate. She didn't sniff, didn't search. She remembered. The bark came again, closer now, faint, unsteady, like a thread unraveling, about to be lost. Elliot gripped the flashlight tighter, legs moving faster. His heart raced. Then they saw it. Another container. The paint almost gone, peeled away by time, only streaks of silver left beneath the beam of the flashlight. It leaned against a slope, vines tangled around it, roots splitting the ground beneath. Elliot ran to it. The door had a heavy lock. rusted but intact. Inside, a faint sound, scraping, whimpering, shallow breaths. Luna stepped forward, pressed her nose to the door, and let out a sharp, urgent whine. Not panic, a warning, a call for help. Elliot didn't stop to think. He pulled out his knife again and went for the hinge. Rust clogged every gap, but something beyond instinct guided his hands now, like memory passed down through heartbeat and breath. With a final yank, the lock broke. The door creaked open, and the smell poured out. Blood, Moldavian filth, desperation. Elliot gagged, pulled his sleeve over his nose, and lifted the flashlight. Inside the cramped 6-foot box, nearly 20 pairs of eyes reflected the light. They didn't blink, didn't bark. They just breathed, struggling. Some scratched at the floor, slowly, weakly, as if they'd done it for days, weeks, a motion that no longer meant escape, only survival. Luna whimpered, dropped her head low, and backed away. Not because she was scared, but because it hurt too much to remember. Elliot stepped forward, knelt at the door, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's okay now. It's okay. We're here." He pulled them out one by one. Some were too weak to walk, their bodies trembling in his arms. Some resisted, not out of aggression, but confusion, as if they couldn't believe a hand could mean safety. Many didn't move at all, skin stretched thin over bone, ribs showing through grime and fear. The last one? A puppy. So small it fit in Elliot's cupped hands. Its body was cold, eyes half closed, breathing in soft, broken threads. Elliot held it close to his chest. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The truth was already written, on their fur, in their silence, and now, in his heart. A rust-red container, tilted sideways, half sunk between the muddy bank and the edge of the river. Part of it hidden under wild, overgrown grass. KC 2739B. The numbers were still there, barely visible, stamped into the edge of the steel door. Elliot moved closer, each step thudding heavier in his chest. Luna stayed close, her gaze locked on the box like she knew what waited inside. And maybe she did. When Elliot touched the cold, rough metal, something passed through him, sharp and sudden, like brushing against a memory that wasn't his. The door was welded shut, but the edge was rusted through, just enough to slide a fingertip in. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the carving knife he used for old wood planks, slipped it into the crack, twisted, pried. The metal didn't give easily. It groaned, it fought back. Tiny shards broke free, clinking to the ground, each one sounding like the echo of something once trapped, something that had cried, scratched, waited, until finally the door cracked loose. Not all the way, just enough for the light to find its way in. And with it came the smell. Thick, damp, rotted. A scent that wrapped around your throat and refused to let go. Not just decay. History. Elliot clicked on his flashlight and angled the beam inside. There was no movement, no eyes staring back. But the signs were there. Paw prints dragged through dust, scratches along the walls, clumps of fur stuck to the corners, forgotten by time. Behind him, Luna didn't step forward. She let out a soft, low whine, the kind of sound that didn't ask for attention. It just existed. Sadness made sound. Elliot turned toward her. "I know. I see it too. This is it." No one had to confirm it. He didn't need approval or proof. He knew. Luna knew. The metal walls knew. She had walked out. But someone else? maybe hadn't. Elliot pulled a sheet of paper from his notebook, ripped it clean, and pressed it to the inside of the door. With shaking hands, he scrawled a line in pencil. Nothing fancy, just true. This was once a prison, but it's also proof. If someone is still out there, I'll find them. He rested his hand on Luna's head. Soft, steady. You made it through so you could tell the story. Now it's my turn. And then, just as the wind swept through the trees, he heard it. A bark. Distant. Dry. Cracked apart like it had been buried under dirt and silence. Not Luna. Something else. Elliot froze. The trees shifted again, and there it was. A broken sound in the wind. Not a growl, not an animal's cry, a voice. Thin, raw, pleading. A call for help. Luna's ears twitched. She turned to Elliot, let out a short grunt, then walked. Not fast, not afraid, but like she knew where she was going. Elliot followed. No questions, no hesitation. The ground softened beneath them, soaked from rain long gone. The woods grew tighter around their path. Branches above tangled like fingers locked in fear. Shadows stretched in every direction. It should have been easy to get lost. But Luna didn't pause. She didn't sniff the ground. She didn't look back. She remembered. The sound came again. Closer. A thread unraveling, barely holding. Elliot moved faster, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping nothing but the hope that they weren't too late. Then, through the dark, they saw it. Another container, smaller, older, its paint almost gone, peeled to dull metal and patches of gray. Vines clung to its side, roots cracked beneath it like the earth had tried to swallow it whole. Elliot ran. The door was sealed with a thick, rusted lock. Behind it, a sound. Scraping. Breathing. Soft cries. Luna pressed her nose to the door, whined once, then again. Louder. A call. A plea. A memory breaking through. Elliot didn't wait. He pulled out his knife and went for the hinge. Rust clogged every space, but something deeper guided his hands. More than instinct. More than fear. It was like time itself was helping. With a final twist, the lock snapped open. The door moaned, and the smell hit them like a wave. Filth, blood, urine, fear. Elliot gagged, sleeve over his nose, flashlight raised. Inside, in the tight metal box, nearly 20 sets of eyes reflected the light. Not glowing, not blinking, just breathing. Software uncertain. Barely there. Some scratched at the floor, too tired to even try, just repeating the motion over and over, like a ritual that no longer meant escape, only survival. Luna whimpered and stepped back. Not from fear, but from memory, from grief, from knowing. Elliot knelt by the door, voice trembling. It's okay now. You're not alone. He started pulling them out, one by one. Some too weak to stand. He carried them. Some flinched at his touch. He whispered until they stilled. Most didn't make a sound. Their bones pressed against his arms, skin stretched thin, fur matted with days of darkness. Then the last one. A puppy. So small it barely filled his cupped hands. Its body was cold, its breathing shallow, its eyes half closed. Elliot held it against his chest, his heartbeat the only thing left to offer. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything that needed saying was already here, in the weight of the puppy, the silence of the forest, and the warmth of a dog who had once been forgotten, but refused to leave anyone behind. Luna didn't need me to be clever, didn't need fancy words. He just needed me to listen. And for the first time, I trusted what I heard. Elliot's mother stood frozen behind the doorframe, watching the television from the hallway. The news anchor was talking about her son, but the words felt distant, like a dream she'd once ignored. Inside the room, her husband sat quietly at the table, the morning paper folded neatly in front of him, the headline bold and undeniable. "You know," she whispered, her voice barely there, "he came to me once. Said Luna had pulled him toward the window. Said something was out there, waiting." Her husband nodded softly, his eyes still on the paper. "And I told him it was just his imagination." "It's okay," he said. "It's not too late. We can still learn to listen." When Hope finally woke up, 4 full days after the IV drip began, the first light of morning was just beginning to spill through the window of the vet clinic. She stirred. A tiny movement, a soft, broken whimper. Then her little nose, dry and trembling, nudged gently against Elliot's hand. He sat up in an instant. Luna rose, too, tail swaying like a whisper in the air. "I knew it," Elliot breathed. "You're going to live." There were no cheers, no headlines, just a white room, a single moment, and something quietly mending between humans and the world they'd stopped listening to long ago. People began to talk. They said Elliot had some kind of special gift, some instinct, some rare sense of knowing. The newspapers called him the boy who feels with his heart. A local magazine wrote, "Sixth grader hears what no one else does." One psychologist even claimed, "Perhaps what we're seeing is a form of deep emotional attunement, something long overlooked by modern education." But Elliot didn't feel gifted. He didn't feel magical. He just knew one thing. He had listened, really listened, to a soul the world had forgotten, and because of that, he no longer felt lost in his own. Luna never left his side. Not for a second. And Hope, though still weak, had started taking small steps, wobbly, clumsy, but steps all the same. Elliot sat on the floor between them, resting a hand on each of their backs. His voice was soft, just for them. "I don't need anyone else to believe," he said. "As long as Luna does. As long as Hope lives. That's enough." Luna lay close, her body pressed against the rug, eyes still fixed on Hope. The little pup was fast asleep, curled tightly inside a small fleece towel near the fireplace. Each breath made her tiny chest rise and fall, shaky but steadier than yesterday, and steadier still than the day before. Elliot tilted his head slightly, watching them both, then whispered, not to Luna, not even to Hope, just to the space between them, like saying something aloud might help him believe it more. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "You'd been there before. That's why you knew how to find the way back." There was no answer, no nod, no sound. But the look in Luna's eyes, deep, calm, and endlessly still, was enough. It said yes. That night, as the fire faded and the house quieted into its gentle breathing, Elliot dreamed again. No more container, no more faint scratching. Just a small house, wooden door shut tight, curtains thick and heavy, blocking every ray of light. Inside the darkness, Luna appeared. But not the Luna Elliot knew. This was Luna from before, coat glossy, posture sharp, a shiny brass nameplate gleaming at her neck. A man's voice echoed. Sharp, unsteady. "Back off! I don't need anyone! You don't understand a thing!" Luna stood still. She didn't bark. She didn't run. She just looked up at the man. He wore an old military jacket, clutched a half-empty bottle. His eyes were bloodshot, face carved with lines and anger, like he was fighting something no one else could see. "Don't look at me like that! I said don't look!" A scream. Then, darkness. The room vanished into silence. Elliot bolted upright. His bedside lamp still glowed softly. Luna was lying at his feet, awake, eyes open, not sleeping. Elliot said nothing. He just reached for his sketch pad and pencil. No need to think, no need to look up references. He began to draw. A barred window, a room without light, a lone German shepherd standing guard. And in the background, the slouched figure of a man curled into himself, hands over his head, mouth open but voiceless. The next morning, Elliot handed the drawing to his father. "I'm not sure what this is, but Luna was there." His dad looked at the page. Didn't ask how, didn't argue. He nodded quietly. "I'll look into it." That afternoon, he returned with a thin folder in his hands. Luna had once served as a military working dog. Trained at Fort Edwards, Unit 22, her assigned handler, Sergeant Thomas Kellner, a veteran of Afghanistan, honorably discharged in 2014 due to severe PTSD. No one really knew why Luna vanished from official records in 2016. The civilian transfer section of her file had been left blank. Only one last address remained: Oak Ridge, a town 40 miles from where they stood. Elliot said nothing. He turned to Luna. She met his gaze, unblinking. No words were needed. His father rested a hand gently on Elliot's shoulder. "Do you think Luna was ever locked up?" Elliot nodded. Slowly. "Not locked like a dog," he said. "Locked like punishment." That night, after his mom had gone to sleep, Elliot brought his blanket down and sat with Luna in the kitchen. Luna leaned her head into his leg. Elliot didn't speak. He just rested his hand on her back, feeling her breath, slow, deep, sometimes catching like a hiccup of memory. He didn't know how to help her forget, but he knew she was trying. And that was enough. Hope stirred nearby, a faint whine. Elliot reached out, gently ran his fingers along her spine. "You're not alone," he said softly. "Luna didn't give up on you." Then, almost like a promise, "I won't ask more, but if you ever want to tell me, I'll listen." A week later, the vet shared her findings. Luna showed signs of trauma in closed, dark spaces. She had once suffered a fractured rib. Her body reacted sharply to the sound of metal clanging. "This type of reflex," the vet explained gently, "is common in dogs that have been abused over a long period of time." Elliot's father went quiet. The vet looked up. "Do you know anything about his past?" Elliot glanced at his dad, then answered quietly, "I know, but I don't have proof." She didn't press, just nodded. There was already truth in her eyes. On the 9th night in Elliot's home, Luna did something she hadn't done before. She walked to the hallway closet, where they kept old toys and boxes of clutter, and began to nudge it with her nose. Then lightly scratched at the door. Elliot rushed over. Inside the pile of forgotten things was an old backpack. His mom used to carry it on volunteer trips. And in its pocket was a photograph. A group of volunteers, smiling in front of a rehab center for veterans. And there, at the far end of the row, stood a man. Not smiling, not looking at the camera. Thomas Kellner. Elliot held the photo in his hands. "You tried to save him," he whispered to Luna. "But no one saved you, did they?" Luna touched her nose to the picture, then turned away, walking slowly back to Hope's side. She lay down beside her. And that night, Elliot picked up his pencil once more. But this time, he didn't draw darkness. He drew Luna standing tall in an open field, sunlight warming her back, ears alert, her eyes still deep, but no longer carrying sorrow. Beside her stood Hope, small, watching. At the bottom of the drawing, Elliot scribbled a line, the words tilted, uneven, but true. No one gets left behind, not even the dogs with scars no one can see. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Beside him, Luna lay still, head resting on his leg, eyes half closed like she was guarding him from the world. And Hope, curled up at the corner of an old blanket, folded into herself like a crushed leaf. The puppy still hadn't stood up yet, but she was breathing. And sometimes, that was enough to start again. The vet said Hope was safe now. No broken bones, no internal damage. His little body had survived. But still for days, he didn't move from the corner. He didn't bark. He didn't eat if anyone was watching. And every time footsteps echoed in the hallway, he flinched like the past was coming back through the floorboards. Elliot didn't force him. Every afternoon after school, he simply sat down beside Luna and Hope on the floor, sketchbook in hand. He didn't draw to impress. No colors, no clean lines, just soft, crooked circles, uneven spirals, quiet pencil strokes that carried more than words ever could. Each shape was a story Hope couldn't tell himself. He drew Hope's eyes, wide, cloudy, searching. He drew the container, tight, sealed, empty of light, where breath had once been shared in silence so thick it felt like drowning. He drew open mouths that made no sound, tongues dry, curled, and a door that never opened until that night. Sometimes his father stood by the door, watching. He had seen his son rescue over 20 dogs. He had heard the vet say that if they'd been just a few hours later, Hope wouldn't have survived. But even with all that, he still couldn't understand how a 12-year-old boy had heard the call for help, how he had known where to go, why Luna had walked into the dark without hesitation. Elliot never offered an explanation. He just kept drawing. And when the house fell silent at night, when everyone else was asleep, Elliot dreamed, not of monsters, not of fear, but of memories that weren't his, but felt like they had passed through his skin. He dreamed of lying curled in a metal box, the warmth beside him slowly fading. He heard the wind outside. The rain, not soft like at his window at home, but hard and cold, beating down on rusted metal like it didn't care who listened. He heard the engine, felt the ground vibrate, saw a man approach with a chain in his hand and eyes that didn't ask, didn't feel. Elliot woke up gasping, the sky outside still dark. Luna was there, eyes open, head lifted slightly like she had felt the same storm pass through him. Hope was asleep, breathing steady. But Elliot's hands were cold with sweat. He reached for a blank sheet and started drawing again, a single circle, but not clean this time. It dipped and twisted, pinched in the center like something had squeezed it too tight for too long. He paused, tightened his grip on the pencil. The ache in his chest wasn't his, but it filled him all the same. Heavy, stone-like. Luna shifted closer. Hope lifted his head. No words, no movement really. But for the first time, Hope didn't look away. Then, slowly, carefully, Hope crept forward. Just a little. Barely a breath. But enough. Enough for Luna to lean in and gently press her nose to his forehead. Elliot saw it happen. His eyes shimmered with something softer than relief. Softer than joy. "It's okay now," he whispered, voice catching. "I'm here. No one's ever going to lock you up again." Hope blinked, still shaking, but he didn't pull back. The next morning, Elliot brought one of his drawings to school. Not for praise, not to share, but to give to his teacher, the one who once said he was too sensitive. She opened the sketchbook and paused. A drawing of a locked shipping container. Over a dozen small circles around it, one for every dog. And in the bottom corner, a jagged, broken shape with words scrawled underneath. Some wounds don't bleed, but they still keep you from sleeping. The teacher didn't say anything. She didn't need to. No one had taught Elliot to write that. No one had told him what animal cruelty looked like in their town. But the way his pencil moved, the way Luna always sat by his side, it was enough. When Elliot got home that day, something felt lighter. Hope still couldn't stand on his own. But when Elliot held out the spoon, he lifted his head and took the food gently, without pulling away, without fear. And after the meal, for the first time, Hope curled up next to Luna, pressed his head against her side, and fell asleep. Elliot didn't draw that night. He just sat there, one hand resting on the old sketch where his words from that morning were still soft against the page. He looked at them, smiled quietly, and whispered the line again to himself. No one gets left behind. Not even the dogs with scars no one sees. Luna glanced up at him. Hope twitched a little in sleep, but didn't startle this time. And Elliot knew, whatever came next, they'd face it together. Even without words. Even without anyone fully understanding him. With just the two dogs curled up beside him, Elliot felt the fear begin to loosen its grip. He didn't need the world to believe him. Just Luna. Just hope. That was enough. He repeated it to himself, quietly, like a whispered thread keeping him grounded in the swell of everything he felt. He stood up from the rug where Hope now slept soundly, belly full after his first complete meal since the rescue. Luna lay close by, eyes half closed, ears still perked, like she was always listening, even in dreams. The basement, once the place where Elliot had first heard a breath behind the wall, had been cleared out, turned into a quiet corner for him and the dogs to rest. A safe space. But that day, while rearranging an old cabinet near the spot Luna had once been trapped, Elliot noticed something strange, a small gap behind a loose panel. He knelt down, brushed away the thick layer of dust, and heard a faint clink as something dropped. A small tin box, rusted at the corners, covered in cobwebs. Elliot picked it up gently, blew the dust off the lid. It wasn't locked, just forgotten. Inside were only two things, a folded, yellowed piece of paper and an old collar with a brass tag. The name etched on it. Luna. Elliot froze. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like the writer had been fighting something inside their body just to get the words out. No date, no name, no greeting, just sentences, fragile and broken, like confessions spoken into a void. I don't know what's happening in my head anymore. Every night I see fire, hear the explosions. I hear Luna howling, but when I sit up, there's only darkness. She's still there. She still looks at me. Not with blame, just looks. And I can't take it. I hit her. I locked her up. Not because I hated her, but because I was afraid. Because I saw in her eyes what I couldn't face in the mirror, that I'm falling apart, piece by piece. If anyone finds this, please don't hate Luna. She didn't do anything wrong. I did. I just didn't know how to live once everything I believed in left me behind. Elliot stopped reading. He didn't understand every word, but he understood something more important. This wasn't a letter for someone else. It was a letter for pain. A last attempt to leave something behind, before being swallowed whole. He sat down on the cold floor. Luna walked over and sat beside him. Elliot didn't look at her. He picked up the collar, turned it over in his hand. On the back, another line had been carved, smaller, softer. Still my girl." Elliot lowered his head, gripped the collar tight. He thought of the nights Luna startled awake, the small scars on her belly, the way she never entered a dark room unless he did first. He thought he'd feel angry, thought he'd want to scream at whoever had done this to her. But that wasn't what rose inside him. It wasn't rage. It was sorrow, a slow, quiet ache. He exhaled, long and steady, then whispered, not to Luna, not to Hope, but to the silence surrounding him. "I don't forgive you, but I understand." Luna tilted her head toward him. "I understand that when pain isn't healed, it finds ways to hurt others, even the ones who stay, even Luna." She let out a soft, low sound. Elliot reached out and placed his hand on her head, gently. She closed her eyes. And in that stillness, the peace between them settled like dust that finally stopped falling. He folded the letter again, placed it back in the tin, set the collar on top. After a pause, he took out a pencil and wrote one simple line on the inside of the lid. "We're still here, and Luna is still loved." He returned the box to the hollow behind the wood, not to bury it, but to keep it. Like a scar, something that doesn't need to disappear, just needs space to heal. That night, after the house fell asleep, Elliot picked up his sketchbook. But he didn't draw warped circles, no shaky lines from the dark. He drew Luna lying beside Hope. He drew a door, open, leading to the sky. And in the corner, he wrote, "We don't need to run from pain. We just need to walk through it together so it doesn't drown out the light." Elliot leaned back against Luna, closed his eyes. She stayed awake. Hope breathed softly. And in that warm, quiet space between three lives, something, gently, finally, began to heal. The next morning, as sunlight touched the basement window, Elliot was already sitting up. He didn't wake Hope. Luna was still resting, her chin on her paws, eyes open, watching Elliot with a calmness that hadn't been there before. A soft kind of peace. The kind that only comes after you've made it through the dark. The drawing from the night before still hadn't dried completely. But Elliot didn't look at it anymore. Instead, he reached for a new notebook. No more circles, no more broken shapes, just a clean page, blank and open like a door waiting to be stepped through. He picked up his pencil, and for the first time, he started to write down what he had heard. Not with his ears, but with something deeper. A metallic scent, sharp and thick, like blood and rust. A sound, repeating, claws scratching softly against metal. A feeling of tightness, damp and cold, as if the air itself was too thin to breathe. He wrote each short line, then began to sketch. A street corner, a rusted back door on a warehouse, a trash bin overflowing with wet wrappers, and somewhere in that scene, a pair of eyes, watching from the dark, too weak to cry out. Luna came over. She didn't howl, didn't whine, didn't sniff the drawing. She just sat beside him, and the two of them stared at the page like they were reading the same language, one that didn't need to be translated. A few days later, someone knocked on the door. It was Dr. Harris, the veterinarian from the clinic across town. She was holding a file, hands shaking slightly as she explained that people had been reporting abandoned dogs along the highway, but no one had been able to reach them before nightfall. Elliot didn't say anything. He just flipped to the middle of his notebook. The drawing was of a bridge, arched concrete, moss-covered. Beneath it were broken pieces of toys, scattered among trash and wet soil. Dr. Harris hesitated. Then she made a call to a rescue team. That afternoon, they found 2 puppies beneath the bridge, soaked, shivering with fever, but alive. The news traveled fast. No one could explain how the strange boy had known. They just began to understand something. Every time Elliot drew, something was saved. Adults stopped asking questions. They simply nodded, handed him satellite maps, blurry security footage, strange coordinates. And Elliot kept writing, sketching, listening. Every morning he sat beside Luna and Hope like he was asking for permission. Like he needed to be still before anything was ever drawn. Sometimes the feelings came suddenly, in the middle of lunch, during sleep, even while he was holding his mother's hand at the market. One day, he dropped to the sidewalk, opened his notebook, and drew a suitcase lying in the reeds. Then he grabbed his mother's arm and ran, all the way to the cemetery at the edge of town. There, inside the bushes near the back fence, they found a gray cat zipped inside an old suitcase, duct tape across its mouth, body freezing cold, but alive. People began calling it a gift. Local papers called him the Whisperer, the boy who hears the unspoken. But Elliot didn't think of it that way. He was just paying attention. To the small sounds no one noticed, to the faintest smells, even when they didn't make sense, to the way Luna grew restless when the sun went down, or how Hope curled tighter in a corner when the air felt wrong. Elliot didn't have powers. He just didn't ignore the signals that the weakest lives were trying to send, with whatever they had left. One night, Luna didn't sleep beside Hope like she usually did. She stood by the basement window, eyes fixed on the trees. Elliot walked over. He didn't ask. He simply placed his hand on her back. Outside, the world was still. But deeper in that silence, there was something else. A sound swallowed by distance. Something that didn't belong to wind or forest. Elliot picked up his notebook. He didn't draw a place, didn't draw a thing. He drew a fear. He drew wide eyes. A blank space. A single dot surrounded by a ring, like he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. Hope woke, walked over. Elliot didn't stop him. Luna didn't turn. He just wrote one line beneath the sketch. Someone is waiting. And just like that, Elliot's journal grew thicker by the day. One notebook, then another. He pinned maps to the wall, drew lines of string from one corner to a sketch, from one gut feeling to a rescue. No one made him do it. No one doubted him anymore. People had simply learned when a creature couldn't cry out loud, sometimes. It took a boy like Elliot to hear for them. And Luna? Luna never changed. She didn't bark, didn't growl. She simply walked beside him. Every time there was a new cry, she was already listening. When Elliot drew a new map, Luna sat just close enough to feel his breath, but never touched him. Each time he opened his notebook, she rested her chin on his leg, eyes facing the window, as if tuned into something deeper than sound. Hope still slept a lot, but he was stronger now. The vet said it was a psychological miracle. Elliot didn't care about the labels. He only knew that Luna always laid between him and Hope, a silent bridge that held them together. Until one early winter night. Elliot was closing his notebook when he noticed Luna hadn't stood up. She was lying still, eyes open but slow. Ears didn't twitch like they always did when Hope whimpered. Elliot wasn't afraid. He just moved closer, then laid down beside her. Elliot reached out and touched Luna's spine, gently, slowly. "You tired, girl?" Luna didn't move, but her eyes stayed on him. Those same old eyes, deep and weathered like a scar too complicated to ever explain. Elliot didn't ask again. He just pulled the notebook closer, flipped to the last untouched page. With a short, worn-down pencil, he began to draw a circle. Not perfect, not even, but just wide enough to hold 3 figures inside: a boy, a puppy, and a large dog, head bowed. Luna shifted slightly, just enough to show she'd seen the drawing. Elliot set the pencil down, then pulled a thinner blanket over her. He sat that way until morning. His parents found him in the little back room, the one he'd set up for Luna and Hope. Hope was curled up tight, her head resting on Elliot's leg. Luna lay still, not breathing anymore. His father opened his mouth to speak, but Elliot raised a hand gently. He stepped forward, slow and quiet, and knelt beside her. Then he placed his right hand, small, smudged with graphite, on the top of her head. "You're not going alone," he whispered, eyes still locked on the gaze that once stared down death from behind concrete walls. "You stayed long enough to save someone else." His mother wrapped her arms around him. Elliot didn't pull away, but he didn't cry either. "I promise you," he said softly, voice calm like wind through pine. "Hope won't be alone, just like you. Weren't left behind." At Luna's small farewell, Elliot didn't choose to bury her in the garden. Instead, he asked his father for an old tin box, the same kind that once held the letter they'd found, and carefully placed a final drawing inside. In the sketch, Luna stood on a wooden bridge, looking down at a river where overlapping circles drifted silently. At her feet was Hope's shadow. To her left, Elliot, and between them, a space of white carrying only one line of text. "Those who understand dreams made of scent and sound never sleep alone." He laid the tin box between 2 trees behind the house. Around it, Elliot planted a circle of lavender. Whenever the wind passed through, a gentle fragrance would rise, a way for Luna to stay, even without a body. That night, Elliot lay next to Hope, the little pup still shivering now and then, not yet brave enough to leave the room without him. "Sleep now," he whispered, his hand stroking the soft fur beneath Hope's chin. "Luna's gone far, but she left behind light." Hope pressed into his chest, still cool to the touch, but no longer trembling. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, no harsh sounds, just the quiet rhythm of a world learning to breathe again, and something beginning to change. Elliot pulled the notebook close. On its cover, a faint smudge of moisture. No one could tell if it came from rain outside or the hand of a child who had once held it too tightly. He didn't write anything, just opened it and let the blank page stay blank, waiting for the next call, waiting for another soul that couldn't speak. Because now, Elliot understood. No one needed to say it. No one had to prove it. Luna had left him one final gift: the ability to listen, with his heart. Hope took his first real steps the next morning, while the dew still clung to the grass behind the house. Elliot sat quietly on the wooden porch, his hands resting lightly on his knees, just watching. Hope's back legs trembled, but he braced himself, pushed forward, and then, in one clear moment of peace, he ran. Not far, not fast, but far enough for Elliot to jump to his feet, clutch the sketchbook to his chest, and break into a wide, silent smile. "I saw it," he whispered. "I saw it. Hope knows now." After weeks of therapy, after so many nights spent lying still and breathing as if afraid to wake a memory, Hope had finally moved on his own. Every step he took wasn't just motion, it was healing. And Elliot knew this wasn't just recovery. It was a choice to live. Their first journey began a week later. A local rescue called about an old house on the outskirts of the next town. People had reported faint barking every night, but no one had ever seen a dog nearby. Elliot didn't ask for details. He just nodded, closed his notebook, and began packing. Dr. Helen, Luna's old vet, had gifted him a small backpack filled with medical supplies and extra food. Hope padded up to him, gently resting his chin on Elliot's thigh. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. They both knew the journey had started. The house stood awkwardly between two hills, overgrown with weeds. No fence, no warning signs. But the sound, faint whimpering, still echoed up from the basement. And this time, they weren't just visitors. They were the ones meant to arrive. Elliot slipped through the old basement window. Hope followed close behind, still cautious in his steps. The air inside was damp and thick, the kind that clung to your breath. His flashlight cut through the dark, revealing a row of decaying wooden crates. Cages. 3 dogs, all chained. One was so thin his bones pressed against patchy, wounded skin. Elliot didn't say a word. He just moved forward, slowly undoing the chain. Hope stood beside him. No barking, no growling, just still. Just present. Just like Luna used to be. A few minutes passed. Then one of the dogs tilted its head and inched toward Elliot. He extended his hand, palm open. The dog lowered its head and touched a single trembling nose to Elliot's fingers. No words, just silence, heavy and whole. A trust barely born. The story spread quickly. Not because Elliot wanted it to. He only ever wanted to save them. But people started calling him the boy who hears the cries no one else can. Dr. Helen had another name for it. A heart that touches silence. Even Elliot's uncle, once a skeptic, stepped forward to help secure permits for a new shelter. But Elliot refused to call it a rescue center. He didn't like the word center. He didn't want beings who once lived behind cages to be labeled with another kind of confinement. He named it instead Silent Meadow, a place where no one had to bark to be noticed, where no one had to cry out to be seen. To exist was enough. There was no official grand opening, just a sunny afternoon and a small wooden sign hung at the gate. Hope ran that day, really ran. No more stumbling, no more shaking. He made a full loop around the field, Elliot chasing behind, laughing, not to prove anything, but simply because it was real. Luna wasn't there. But Elliot knew if she had seen this moment, she'd just lie still, eyes quietly gleaming, like the very first time they met. Elliot sat in the grass. Hope laid his head on Elliot's lap. In the distance, a group of dogs sat in a loose circle, rescues from everywhere, each one with different fur, different scars, but none of them made a sound. They didn't need to. They had already been seen and heard. The sun dropped lower behind the trees, casting the whole field in deep orange. Elliot opened his sketchbook, turned to a blank page. He didn't draw a dog or a person, just a set of circles overlapping, symbolizing memories that had touched, healed, and stayed beside each other. Beneath it, he wrote slowly, "Where creatures who cannot speak are still listened to." He closed the sketchbook. On the table beside him was a handwritten letter, the penmanship still uneven, but steady, like it had been practiced across many quiet nights. There was no name on the letter. No question marks, just a single stream of words, meant to be sent, not answered. To those who once silenced a living being, I don't know your name. Don't know if you were the one who yelled, who struck, who tied them up, or who simply forgot to feed them. But I think I understand why. I didn't write this to blame you. I wrote it to retell what Luna, Hope, or any of them could never say out loud. Elliot paused. Outside the window, Hope lay by the big tree, the one Luna used to sit beneath. The wind brushed through the last light of day, softening the white fur along Hope's back, until he seemed to glow in silence. I used to think, if someone hurt an animal, they must be bad. But now I see, maybe they were once hurt too, and no one ever listened. Luna lived with someone like that. A soldier returned from war. She never spoke of it. But in her eyes, I saw deep shadows. Nights when she lay pressed against the wall, eyes wide, the flinch at a sudden gust of wind. She didn't hate her old owner, and neither do I. Elliot set the pen down, leaning back against the wooden wall. The room fell still, only the quiet flick of a few loose papers rustling in the breeze. He opened a tin box, placed the letter inside, and sealed it in an envelope. Beside it, a drawing. A boy in a worn shirt, running through a sunlit field of gold. Beside him, a small dog, one ear perked, body tilted, gaze lifted in trust. Further behind, a shadow of a larger dog, still watching. The face was unclear. Only the silhouette stretched across the pale sky. But anyone who had ever known a friend like Luna would recognize it instantly. No title, no caption, just a picture, full of the things never spoken. Elliot brought the letter to the old post office in town. No proper address, only a line on the envelope. To the one who once didn't know how to love an animal. The postmaster, an elderly man with silver hair, took the envelope, about to ask something. But when he saw Elliot's eyes, he simply nodded and placed it into a special drawer he'd kept for years, where letters with no destination could still rest, like quiet offerings. Not everything needs a reply. Sometimes, it's enough that someone listened. That night, as Elliot returned to Silent Meadow, he noticed something strange. Standing at the gate were 3 adults, 2 women, and an old man, each holding the leash of a dog once discarded. One had torn ears, one had no tail, and one was blind in one eye. "Are you Elliot?" the older woman asked softly. "They say, you can hear what they can't say." Elliot didn't answer. He walked forward, knelt down, and extended his hand. The blind dog stepped forward and touched his finger, and that was enough. Hope padded beside him, sat quietly. No barking, no reaction, just presence, like Luna once gave to Hope. And now it was Hope's turn to pass it on. When night settled, Elliot lay beside Hope in the small wooden room. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, like voices too gentle to speak. Elliot opened his sketchbook again, added one more detail to yesterday's drawing. This time a new circle, smaller, nestled inside the others, and in its center the imprint of a dog's paw. Not perfect, but unmistakable, like memories that once hurt and still left something beautiful behind. Elliot didn't know if the letter would ever reach anyone's hands, but that didn't matter, because Hope was asleep. And Luna, though laid to rest, was still there, in every pause between words, in every life being healed, in every step that no longer trembled. He didn't need anyone to believe him. He just needed hope to live. And that was enough. Inside the little wooden room, late afternoon light filtered gently through the window and spread across the desk. Elliot opened his notebook and slowly turned to a blank page. He didn't draw right away. Didn't write anything either. He simply sat. For a long while. Then he began. There was no greeting. Only 2 carefully underlined words. I write. I write about a dog named Luna. She was once a working canine. She saved lives, walked through war zones, lay quietly beside a man during storm-torn nights. But it was that very man, who later locked her away in the dark. Not out of hate, but because he didn't know how to face the dark within himself. Elliot paused, took a deep breath. Outside, Hope shifted in his sleep. His breathing was steady. Beneath the table, one sharp ear twitched every time the pen touched paper. I write about Hope, a soul who couldn't stand when found, didn't cry, didn't resist, didn't betray, just trembled, again and again, like his memories hurt more than a wound on his body. I don't blame the ones who broke Hope's bones. I didn't write this letter to demand apologies. Silence has already said enough. I only wish that those who ever hurt an animal, whoever tied a leash too tight, whoever forgot a bowl of water, read these words, that it is still possible to begin again, that no one, not even those who cannot speak, deserves to be left behind. Elliot looked up, eyes wet, but no tears fell. Luna never cried. And since Luna passed, neither did Elliot. Not because it didn't hurt, but because Luna had taught him how to hold pain and turn it into something useful. He folded the letter, carefully slipping it into an envelope. Inside, he added a sketch. The lines were simple, unpolished, but clear enough for anyone to understand. A boy in a faded shirt running through a sunlit field of gold. Beside him, a small dog, ears folded, tail wagging, eyes glowing beneath the evening light. And in the distance, the shadow of a larger dog, upright, still. The face unseen, but the stance unmistakable. The shadow turned back, watching them. Not interfering, not interrupting, just there. Exactly how Luna used to be beside Elliot. Beneath the drawing, Elliot wrote a single line. If there is a place where creatures don't have to speak to be heard, this is it. The next morning, Elliot brought the letter to the old post office at the edge of town. The postmaster, eyes clouded with age, received it gently and read the line on the envelope. To someone who once didn't know how to love an animal. He looked at Elliot as if to ask something, but said nothing. Just nodded and placed the envelope into the special drawer he had kept for years, a place for nameless, addressless letters filled with hope. On the way home, Elliot didn't hurry. Hope walked beside him, not running, just a steady pace. Every time a strange sound stirred nearby, Hope would tilt his head as if asking, "Should we go there?" Elliot smiled. "Not today. Just a walk for now." That afternoon, he sat under the tree near the field, the spot where Luna used to rest. In his hands was a new notebook, pages still perfectly white, but this time he didn't write a word. He just sat and listened. A blind dog had been brought in by an elderly couple. Another, thin and missing a leg, was found by a schoolgirl digging through a trash bin. Each breath, each glance, each subtle movement whispered things that grown-ups never saw. Elliot didn't need to translate. He only needed to draw. Each life, a circle, uneven, imperfect, but connected. And within every circle, there was space for rebirth. Night fell. Hope curled beneath the bed. Elliot turned off the light and looked up at the ceiling, where he had pinned a small map. Every place he and Hope had been, marked with a tiny red dot. Each dot was a story. Each story, a scar. Soothed. Elliot clasped his hands and closed his eyes. He didn't pray, didn't call out any name. He just kept still. A stillness so deep that if one listened closely enough, they might hear the soft footsteps of Luna, still walking beside him, silent and unwavering. This isn't just a touching story between a boy and a forgotten dog. It's proof that connection needs no words, and that compassion can awaken things we thought were lost forever. when Elliot placed his hand on that old wall and whispered, "I hear you," I felt a lump in my throat. A child with no power, no strength, just a heart pure enough to feel the pain of another being. And the miracle was this: the dog heard Elliot, too. We live in a world filled with noise, but sometimes the sea that morning was not the ocean of paintings or of memories. It wasn't blue. It wasn't gentle. It didn't hum lullabies and soft ripples. It was something else entirely, like a cracked mirror stretched to the horizon, cold, still, and tight-lipped. The wind didn't stir enough to birth waves, yet wasn't soft enough to be called calm. It merely flowed, like time moving in reverse, retracing its own current, pulling Lucan Thorne back to a place where a part of him had once been lost. The Meridian Echo, a civilian patrol vessel, sliced through the waters off the southern rim of Arlo Bay. A maritime graveyard known for its shipwrecks, sparse traffic, and fewer survivors than stories. At 38, Lucan, once a naval officer, now a quiet volunteer in marine conservation, held the wheel with steady hands, no longer driven by ambition or duty, but by the desire to escape sirens, shouts, and memories that still bled beneath his skin. Then something strange pulled him to his feet. Far ahead, within the dull drift of waters that moved like a forgotten melody, he saw a shadow cutting against the tide. Not a boat, not driftwood, and certainly not the body of a sea creature. Lucan raised his binoculars, eyes narrowing. What emerged was a rust-laced shipping container, old and battered, as though it had clawed its way out of the underworld. No markings, no flags, no signs of origin, just a metal box, adrift and alone. Without hesitation, he veered the helm left, throttle up, closing the distance. No distress beacon, no mechanical hum, only a silence too deliberate to be natural. The container rocked slightly as the Meridian Echo drew alongside. Lucan secured the line, pulled on his gloves, and shone his flashlight along the seams. The air hit him first, an overpowering mix of stale salt water, oxidized steel, and something else. Something that once had a heartbeat, or perhaps still did. He leaned in towards the latch. The padlock was corroded, unsealed, unsecured. With a firm twist, the hinge surrendered with a sound that felt like memory snapping under its own weight. The door swung open. And for a moment, Lucan's entire world stilled. Inside were 5 bodies, large, curled into themselves, unmoving. No barking, no growling, no desperate scramble. These were not beasts bracing for escape. These were remnants, silent, spent. German shepherds, dogs often celebrated as emblems of strength, intelligence, and loyalty, now looked like statues molded from fur, bone, and despair. Lucan didn't remember when he dropped to his knees. His flashlight caught the eyes of the nearest one. Not wet, not wild, just pale and salted like frost over ash. In that gaze, there was no plea, no spark, just the flat resignation of something the world had already forgotten. No water, no food, no airflow, and worst of all, no one who ever turned back. He reached out. No reaction. His fingers brushed the back of the closest dog, its coat patchy, inflamed, raw in places where hopeless scratching had torn the skin. The body trembled, not from fear, but because its internal warmth was fading fast. Lucan raised his radio, voice low but urgent. "Living beings inside. I need immediate veterinary emergency response." While waiting, he did the only thing he could, wrapped each one in his jacket, wiped dry the eyes that had given up tears long ago, slid thermal blankets from his emergency kit beneath their sunken frames. None resisted. None snapped. They accepted his hands, not from trust, but from the absence of alternatives. Then one lifted its head. Barely. It looked at him, and something inside Lucan cracked wide open. Not because of sorrow, but because in that fragile stare there was a single question, unspoken, unformed by words, but piercing through every wall he had ever built. "Are you real?" No answer could ever suffice. He simply uncapped a rescue water bottle, letting drops fall gently on its dry lips. The dog's throat, parched and rough, strained to swallow. And within seconds, the other four began to stir, minutely, uncertainly, as if life itself was whispering. Not yet. No sound. No cries. But life, faint and tremulous, began to vibrate like the first breath in a long-forgotten hymn. By the time the rescue team arrived, the sun had already started its western descent. The waves remained mild, yet the sea itself seemed to clutch its secrets tighter. The emergency vets disembarked quickly. At first, they didn't understand why Lucan had called in a level 1 emergency for dogs, but then they saw the 5 of them. Unmoving, unresisting, only breathing in quiet surrender, and they too fell silent. No questions followed. One of them bent down to gently clean the back of a dog, and paused. Tangled in the matted fur around its neck was a fragment of torn leather, a weathered strip from a collar. It bore just 3 faint letters. R.I.V. Lucan leaned in, eyes fixed on the worn piece, and softly, with something close to reverence, he whispered, "Riven. Not a name, a beginning." He rose, his gaze now sharpened with purpose. In front of him weren't just 5 abandoned dogs. They were 5 unanswered questions, living, breathing proof that someone had once chosen silence over justice. And now, silence would no longer suffice. That night, out on the deck beneath a sky smeared in shadow, Lucan never left their side. Not for a single breath, not for the passing of a single cloud. He lay next to Riven, the first one he had named, his hand resting gently along the curve of the dog's spine, where each shallow breath rose not with the scent of rusted metal anymore, but with something softer, earthier, something like the warm smell of soil that still clings to the living. On the other side, the remaining 4 had also begun to breathe in rhythm, slow and fragile, yet real. They didn't need to know who he was, didn't need a reason, didn't need a story. They simply accepted. And that, perhaps, is always the first step of any true bond, not trust, but acceptance. Lucan looked up toward the heavens. The moon was veiled, nothing more than a pale echo behind drifting sheets of cloud that hung like fragments of memories yet to be stitched together. A breeze whispered across the surface of the sea, soft, barely felt, but with sound nonetheless. It sounded like someone, or something, was whispering, "Don't let them be forgotten." And in that instant, Lucan Thorne, the man who had once sworn to keep himself untouched by the weight of any more lives, stepped silently into a story he had never meant to enter. A story that began in a fracture at sea. He didn't know how long he remained seated on that rust-veined deck, surrounded by the groan of wind threading through corroded railings, beneath a dim, damp light that bled like it came from an old lantern hung crooked in fog. The surface of the ocean stayed still, but within him, something was shifting. No thunder, no chaos, only a slow, silent turning, like the undercurrent deep beneath calm waters. The 5 dogs lay unmoving. Not a whimper, not a bark. They didn't claw or scratch or plead with their eyes. They didn't seek to be seen. Whatever point of desperation that usually compels a creature to cry out, that had long since passed, they were beyond begging, and their silence wasn't peace. It was the kind of stillness that settles when despair has sunk into the bone and become nature. And that, That was what frightened Lucan the most. When he moved toward the container again, tools in hand, bolt cutter in one, a length of rope in the other, there was a strange sensation that crawled along his spine, like a gaze not born of man nor sky, but of sea, distant yet unwavering, fixed upon every movement he made. He wasn't sure where it came from, only that it was there, watching. He planted one foot against the container's lip, leaned his weight into the lashings, and bent downward. A cold wind grazed the back of his neck, sharp, metallic, carrying a scent too familiar to mistake. The scent of flesh soaked in brine too long, of old blood dried into fabric, of something the battlefield calls the last breath of a soul. He didn't have much time. Lucan pushed the door open. It gave way completely now, and dropped to his knees. The first dog trembled as his hand touched fur. Its eyes were half-lidded but listening. Lips cracked, nose stained faintly with blood. Its hind leg was swollen, maybe from being slammed around inside the steel box. He bent lower, slipped both arms beneath it, and lifted with the same care he had once used for wounded comrades dragged from crossfire, each motion slow, each breath measured, each shift designed to keep pain from waking. The dog was weightless, not because it was small, but because most of its life had already been drained away. Just as he laid it down onto the deck, there was a sound. Barely a splash, more a breath taken in water. Lucan looked up. Off the port side, a thin, precise cut across the surface of the sea, then another, and then a dorsal fin, rising in silence, parting the water with a slow, deadly grace, moving like a shadow that didn't need to breathe. Lucan exhaled, not startled. The shark wasn't the problem. The shark was only a consequence. What chilled him was the reason for its presence, the smell of blood, the lure that had drawn it here. And that smell was coming from the very lives he was trying to save. He turned back to the container. One by one he brought them out, cradling each body with a reverence that felt like apology. Some were nearly unconscious, their pulse too faint to be felt without a stethoscope. Some opened their eyes but stared through him, as if nothing real remained worth connecting to. One, the last, when he reached out his hand, simply turned its head away. Not with anger, not with fear, just refusal. He paused, caught by the weight of that look, one absent of blame, void of hope, a gaze that didn't ask whether he was salvation or another form of torment. It didn't resist him. It simply no longer cared. And that was what cut deeper than any bullet or shard of shrapnel ever had. "It's okay," he whispered, more plea than comfort. "I'm not the one who locked you in here." As he laid the fourth onto the ship's floor, the sea behind him broke, suddenly, violently. A nameless wave slapped the hull, painting it with a streak of thin, pale red. The shark was close now. Lucan caught a glimpse of it sliding along the container's edge. Not aggressive, not desperate, just testing, waiting, calculating. He had no more time. With a final surge of effort, Lucan leapt down to the small lifeboat tied to the ship's side, grabbed the oar, and rowed hard toward the container. One hand on the rudder, the other reaching back, he pulled the final dog, the one who had turned away, onto the tarp. The creature let out a sound. A whine. Soft. Not desperate, but real, the first sound any of them had made. Lucan leaned close, pressing his palm to its head. Not stroking. Not soothing. Just touching. So it would know. It was no longer alone. In that sliver of suspended time, the dog slowly turned its head and brushed its dry, cracked nose against the leather of Lucan's glove. Its tongue, parched and brittle, gave the faintest lick. Not from thirst, but like a period at the end of a sentence between two beings who had, somehow, crossed an invisible threshold together. By the time all 5 dogs were brought aboard, the sea had changed. No wind, no wave, just a salted mirror, stretching quiet under a sun that leaned westward, pale and tired. Lucan didn't glance back at the container. He knew what he'd see if he did. His own reflection, etched not in skin, but in the version of himself who once believed salvation came in uniforms, orders, and clearly defined enemies. That man who thought he understood what it meant to save something. But he was no longer that man. Now, on the damp deck of the Meridian Echo, with 5 fragile bodies curled side by side like extinguished candles waiting for dawn, began a different kind of beginning. One not drawn by fate or mission, but born in the silence between breath and surrender. No one spoke. No voice needed to rise. Only the stillness remained. But this time, it no longer bore the shape of despair. For the first time since he'd opened that rust-bitten door, Lucan felt it. The silence wasn't death anymore. It was a vow, one that required no words to exist. The sea held its breath, as if the entire ocean dared not interrupt the fragile, flickering pulse of life aboard. The Meridian Echo drifted slowly toward the support harbor, still 3 hours away. But Lucan didn't measure time by distance anymore. What mattered now was keeping these souls from slipping back into nothingness before they had something, anything to hold on to. A name, a tether, a whisper-thin thread that said, "You are here." He sat down beside them, salt mist soaking through the wooden planks and into his jeans. The nearest one, the same dog who had licked his hand during the rescue, now breathed steadily. Its eyes remained closed, no longer swollen or burning. Its chest rose and fell so lightly, it seemed as if even its own body didn't quite believe it had been granted permission to continue. Lucan ran his hand along its spine, fingers tracing the bones like ruins from a forgotten monument, once strong, once proud, now surviving. "Riven," he whispered, letting the word emerge not as a label, but as something summoned. "I'm calling you Riven." Not because the name sounded bold, not because it carried any grand meaning, but because when he'd looked into those eyes, fractured, worn, like a fissure that someone once tried and failed to mend, there was no other word that fit. This was a creature that had been torn, but had never shattered. Riven, the broken, but unbroken. To Riven's right lay a smaller dog, sleeker, darker, with one ear folded down like a forgotten wing. And yet there was fire behind its gaze. When Lucan extended his hand, it didn't flinch, nor did it approach. It simply watched, intensely, unblinking, as if used to being seen, but never truly recognized. And only then did Lucan realize this one was female. In that moment, something beautiful struck him, not in the gentle way flowers bloom, but in the way a flower dares to rise through scorched earth. He pressed his palm gently on her shoulder, nodded, and let a name shape itself in his chest before he gave it breath. Naira. Not because it reminded him of someone, not because it belonged on any list of favorite female dog names, but because Naira sounded like a blade of wind, sharp, brief, and lingering. A sound that could slice through silence and still hang in memory long after it was gone. Naira, the ember that refused to go out. He turned to the third, a dusty blend of copper and silver, limbs long but thinned by hunger, nails filed down to blunt shadows. It twitched gently every few moments, as if caught mid-dream, perhaps reliving a time before cages and darkened steel. Perhaps, in its sleep, it still ran. Lucan let out a soft breath, one that trembled into a smile. Not of joy, but of recognition. "Blitz," he said. Blitz, the lightning that never made it to thunder. The flash that still remembered how to move fast, even if the world had slowed it down. Not powerful, just present, and sometimes that was enough. The dog stirred, a tiny shift of muscle and fur. Its mouth tugged upward, not quite a grin, not quite pain, but Lucan saw it, that shimmer of something not yet gone. And then there were two. The fourth lay farthest away, near the edge of the deck, still and impossibly quiet. Since being lifted from the container, it hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't acknowledged anything. For a while, Lucan had feared it had passed. But then, as a breeze passed through and tousled the fur on its ear, he saw the faintest breath ripple through its side. So soft, so slight, it seemed like the sea itself had lent it life just one more time. He waited, and the waiting felt sacred. He didn't speak, not a word, simply walked closer and sat beside it, the silence between them not a void but a presence of its own. And when his hand came to rest upon the salt-dusted fur, there was no reaction. But that was all right. That was enough. For presence itself is a kind of language, a kind of message that doesn't require acknowledgement to be heard. "Gale," he whispered, voice softer than the wind. Gale, a wind that never needed to howl to shift the world's course. It was a name meant for one who never asked to stand at the center, but who, even in stillness, never truly disappeared. And then, there was the largest of them all. The dog at the heart of the group, taller, broader, its body powerful though worn thin by hunger and exhaustion, carried with it the gentlest presence, a kind of steady grace that came not from strength alone, but from the way its gaze held a calm so profound it could only belong to a creature who had seen more than any life should ever be asked to carry, and survived. Lucan lowered himself beside it, hand pressed lightly to its chest, where the heart still beat, slow, certain, unwavering, like the wall of clay that holds against a flood without ever cracking. "Orin," he murmured. Orin, the bearer of burdens for them all, and yet the one who never showed the weight. Not because of might, not because of duty, but because of the way it stood, silent and central, a quiet anchor, as though ready to shoulder any storm without asking why. And so, beneath the bleak afternoon sky, on that weathered ship's deck, amid the rust-scented air and the sunlight that tilted like a blade never quite touching ground, Lucan gave names to 5 living souls no one had meant to remember. Riven, the fracture that never broke. Nera, a blade honed through pain. Blitz, the small bolt of lightning still believing it could run. Gale, the stillness capable of shifting everything. Orin, the final wall between harm and collapse. None of them answered. None barked. Yet, as the last light of day slipped across the blanket spread out on the deck, those 5 beings, somehow without signal or sound, drew just a little closer to each other. Lucan remained seated, back against the wooden wall, eyes on the bleeding horizon. He wasn't certain what awaited him once they reached the shore. But there was one thing he knew beyond doubt. As long as they had names, they had never been forgotten. And so long as he could remember that, he still had reason to go on. The cabin stood halfway up the slope of a pine-shadowed hill, where the trees stretched their long silhouettes toward the sea, where the wind no longer carried the sting of salt into the eyes, where the hum of insects had replaced the drone of engines overhead, where there were no command boards, no barbed wire fences, no shouting voices tearing through sandstorms, just quiet and breath and the hush of a place not made for war, a place he had kept from his days in uniform, once intended never to return to, once abandoned like a flawed memory. And now It had become sanctuary for 6 beings who needed one another. No one had to say it, no logic was needed, no arguments made. They came here together. And because of that, they remained together. The first morning in the cabin was like a symphony written without notes. Lucan opened the window and let the sunlight filter in through warped wooden slats. Outside, dew clung to each blade of grass. Inside, on the worn rug spread across the living room floor, 5 silent shapes lay close, unmoving since the night before. No whines, no scratches, no shifting limbs, but they breathed. And that, at least, was something. He prepared breakfast, simple rice porridge, boiled with bone broth, not a feast, but enough to answer the hunger that had stretched from ocean to earth. When he placed each bowl before them, none leapt forward. There was no snapping, no wild hunger, no desperate scramble common to strays starved too long. They merely lifted their heads, then waited. Eyes on the food, then on him. Not because they weren't hungry, but because somewhere in their pasts, they had learned that to eat was sometimes to fall into a trap, to be shocked, to be commanded. Lucan stepped back. He didn't speak. He sat quietly on the wooden chair by the window, opened a notebook left untouched for years, and let his eyes say the rest. 1 minute, 2, then 3. Orin, the largest, was the first to bend forward. Slow, careful. Like a being who had seen too many deaths begin with a meal, his tongue touched the porridge. No pain followed, no hidden sting, no punishment, just porridge. Only porridge. Orin ate, and as if stirred by some gentle, invisible thread, Naira followed, then Blitz, then Gale, and finally, Riven. None looked to the others. But somehow, in some quiet way, they all knew. If Orin chose, they could choose too. A week passed as though time no longer ticked by in seconds or hours, but in the smallest signs of return. A yawn that no longer flinched, the soft thump of a tail on wood at the sound of something familiar, a gaze no longer fixed on meaningless distance. Naira was the first to step beyond the porch. 3 paces forward, then back, then 5 more, then still, standing at the edge of grass before the tree line. She sniffed the wind. Didn't bark. But the way her ears lifted like twin radars, the way her tail swayed faintly like ripples across a pond, these things said enough. There was no rust inside her anymore. Something had started to flow again. Blitz ran. He ran not with the desperation of escape, but with the reckless joy of a child just learning that legs aren't only for fleeing pain, they're for flying. He darted through the trees, crashed into a laundry pole, dove headfirst into a patch of wildflowers and toppled backward, legs in the air, dust in his fur. But he didn't whimper. He bounced up, blinked, and smiled with his eyes. And Lucan understood in that moment. Blitz had reclaimed his speed, not as a reflex to terror, but as a celebration of motion. Gale hadn't yet stepped beyond the porch. Yet every morning, every evening, he faced the forest. Not with fear, not with hunger, but with a quiet, unshakable focus, as though listening for something ancient carried on the wind. Not gunfire, not commands, but something older and softer, like the whisper of memory. Some dogs run, some stand still. Gale listened. And Lucan, watching him, knew better than to interfere with that choice. Orin liked the center of the yard, head between paws, eyes half closed, letting the sun settle into his bones. But whenever Riven stepped outside, Orin rose without hesitation, shoulders square, posture still, not as a follower, not by order, but like a silent sentry who had chosen, without being asked, to keep watch. Not just for Riven, but for all of them. and by doing so he held the entire pack in place. Riven was always the last to leave the porch. On the 17th morning, when the sun had just begun to stretch its limbs across the mist-wet grass, Lucan opened the door earlier than usual. Riven was already there, standing still in the threshold, neither stepping forward nor turning back. The breeze played with the tufts of his neck fur, the grass quivered in anticipation, and Riven's eyes lingered on a distant blackened tree trunk that rose like a scar among the pine. Lucan didn't know what the dog was remembering, but Riven moved. One step, then another. No sprint, no glance behind, just motion, slow, sure, as if retracing a path only he remembered, to a place no one else had ever been. And as Riven stepped off the porch, Oren followed. Naira was close behind. Blitz tore into the woods like a spark. Gale descended the steps last and didn't turn back. For the first time, they moved as one. No commands, no alpha, just 5 creatures whose shared pain had finally found a rhythm. Not marching, not charging, but walking. A low, quiet beat that needed no conductor. Lucan watched from the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. But his chest burned warm in a way it hadn't for years, not from triumph, not from pride, and certainly not because he had saved them, but because they were living. Not for duty, not for humans, but for themselves. And that was enough. He had not taught them to be free. He had simply stepped aside long enough for them to remember how. That night, 5 bodies circled around a fire. The wind off the ocean had lost its sting. The flames didn't rise high, but they were steady, bright enough to reflect in eyes that no longer wandered. Lucan sat in their midst, pretending to poke at the firewood, but really, he was listening to the breathing, to the soft scratch of nails on wood, to the tiny groan as Naira rested her head on Oren's back, and he didn't move away. No one had to teach them how to sleep indoors. No one called their names. No one whistled them home. They came back because they chose to. They lay close because they needed to. And in that small miracle of choice, Lucan understood. This place, with no commands, no sirens, no drills, was the first place they'd ever been allowed to be themselves. And for that reason alone, it was the only place worthy of beginning again. But not every wound leaves blood. Not every pain can be seen in sunlight. And not all survival is healing. Lucan began to understand this in the long hours after dusk, when the house fell into hush, when every creak of the floorboards felt amplified, when even the firelight seemed to pull back into its own thoughts, and all that remained was the sound of breath, the whisper of nails across wooden planks, and sleep that never fully settled. Gale was the first to fracture. Not during the day. Never then. When awake, he moved with eerie grace, footsteps light, gaze always resting just beyond the trees, as if holding a conversation with something no one else could hear. But at night, when the lights went out, when even the hearth was reduced to cinders, when the wind moaned through the tin roofing like a forgotten voice clawing at memory, Gale trembled. At first it was a shiver, then curled limbs, paws scratching the floor in a soft panic, ears folded back, teeth clenched, no barking, no howling, just a body fleeing, not toward, but away. Lucan never called his name. He simply moved beside him, sat close, placed one hand gently on the tightened shoulder blades. No pressure, no control, just presence, and strangely, impossibly, that was enough. The quaking subsided, and Gale, though never awake to notice, learned, slowly, deeply, that presence could be louder than any comfort spoken aloud. Riven never slept before Lucan. At first, Lucan believed it was instinct, some unspoken role of leadership, the strongest staying alert, the last to close their eyes, guarding the unseen doors of a house that never locked. But one night, Lucan faked sleep earlier than usual. He lay still, breathing shallow, eyes barely shut. Riven didn't rest. He paced, slow, silent. He circled the house, not out of restlessness, but vigilance. And when the others slept, he stood at the back porch, staring into the woods, the place where no one could hear a sigh. He didn't bark, but every time a foreign breeze rustled unfamiliar branches or a rodent snapped a twig under its tiny weight, Riven would rise, his whole form taut, a bow pulled and ready. Lucan understood. Some warriors, no matter how far from the battlefield, never really leave the war. Naira feared aircraft. Lucan discovered this on a winter morning when a rescue helicopter flew low across the hills to survey the flood-ravaged terrain, its rotors chopping through the sky with a mechanical growl not unfamiliar to those who had lived near the coast. But the very instant that sound pierced the silence, Naira flattened herself to the ground, every muscle trembling, her mouth shut tight without a bark, yet saliva spilled in thin streams from the corners of her lips. She fled beneath the bed, scratching, hissing, eyes wide with the kind of terror that didn't simply react to noise but relived it, as though every metallic rumble peeled back time and slammed her into 4 steel walls that had once screamed louder than she ever could. Lucan didn't follow. He simply sat on the porch, waited for the sound to pass, then opened the door to the room, lowered himself to the floor, and waited again. Waited until Naira edged her nose into the hallway. Not out of trust, but because exhaustion left her no other choice. He lifted his hand. She didn't lick it, didn't come closer. But at least, she didn't turn away. And that was enough for one day. Blitz never played alone. Lucan noticed this on a clear afternoon when he tossed a rubber ball into the yard. The faded orange sphere, slightly deflated, once used in K-9 training years ago. Blitz saw it. His eyes lit up, and he sprinted toward it, paws pounding the dirt, breath sharp with excitement. But after a few steps, he stopped, turned back. No one was running with him. No one was chasing. He stood there, still, watching, and then abandoned the ball, walked back, lay down next to Oren. Lucan tried again. And again. Tossed the ball. Called his name. Whistled. But Blitz never gave chase, unless Naira or Gale or Riven ran too. It wasn't that Blitz didn't want to play. It was that he feared being left behind. In a world where running alone could mean electric shock, starvation, or simply never being let back inside, Blitz had learned something no creature should ever have to learn. That play was only safe if someone ran with you. And that kind of innocence, ripped out of the heart too early, doesn't come back easily. Lucan didn't try to fix them. He wasn't a therapist, he wasn't a vet, and he damn sure wasn't a hero. He was just a man with too many gunshots echoing in his memory to ever live comfortably in the roar of the modern world. But maybe because of that, he understood. Some wounds weren't meant to be healed. They just needed space to breathe. Night fell, and in the quiet of the wooden house, 6 souls lay close. No orders, no commands, no force. Riven still kept watch. Gale still dreamed. Naira still flinched whenever the wind roared against the roof. Blitz still curled against Oren's back. And Oren, still the silent wall holding them all, lay unmoving, unreactive, as though he had taken it upon himself to carry the stillness the others could not bear. Lucan didn't intervene. He simply lit a small lamp on the back porch. Not for light, but so that if, somewhere in their dreams, someone got lost, they'd know there was still a place waiting for them to come home to. That morning did not begin with birdsong, nor with the soft thump of Blitz's tail against the wall when he heard the door creak open, nor with the clinking of a spoon against a pot as Lucan stirred breakfast like he always did. That morning began with a knock, barely audible, as if even the sound itself feared it might shatter. He opened the door. There was no one there. Only a white envelope, unmarked, no name, no sender, no postal seal, as if it had slipped out of thin air or been left by a hand too used to hiding from light. Lucan picked it up, closed the door behind him. He didn't make a habit of opening letters quickly, but this time the skin of his palm went cold as steel. There was something in the weight, precise, deliberate, something in the way the paper brushed his skin that changed the rhythm of his breath. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, distorted, color-worn like it had been taken with a dying thermal lens. A satellite image, shot from high above, the frame edges washed with glare where the sun caught the camera glass. In the center, dense jungle. Amid the foliage, faint rectangles, buildings, maybe, structured too cleanly to be natural, scattered like camouflaged barracks. And there, in a clearing beside a barbed wire fence, 5 small dots. Too small to identify. But to anyone who had trained with K9 units, who had once studied silhouettes through the blur of infrared scopes, who had learned to recognize outlines from the shadows they cast, it was unmistakable. Dogs. 5 of them. One lay on its side, as if restrained or held by the neck. Another stood, tail clamped down, head lowered. The remaining 3 stood in a circle around the others, a defensive shape, primal, instinctual, not trained but born into them. On the back of the photo, a single line, printed in slanted black ink, as cold as a handwritten sentence carved by a judge. They weren't abandoned, they were processed. Lucan sat still on the wooden chair, eyes locked on the photograph, hand gripping so tightly that the paper's edge curled like the spine of a blade. A breeze passed through the room, lifting the curtain in a gentle wave, making the floorboards groan with a sound like a tired breath. But he didn't hear it. He had already fallen back, into a part of his memory where even the wind could not reach. Handle it. The phrase was not unfamiliar to someone who had served in special operations. It was never vague, never gentle. It never simply meant resolve. It always meant erase. That night, while the dogs slept in a soft circle around the fireplace, bodies twitching now and then in dreams not yet released, Lucan sat at the table, spreading a map over the grainy wood like a soldier laying open an old wound. He marked every K9 training site he'd ever known, official and otherwise. And then he stared at the photo again. The terrain didn't match any U.S. forest. The canopy was too thick, the leaves too dark, the treetops serrated like fangs, more jungle than woodland. It could have been Southeast Asia, could have been Central America, could have been one of those forgotten green chambers buried deep in the African continent. But it wasn't the foliage that chilled him. It was the faded GPS numbers printed in the bottom corner. The line was cut off, but not enough to hide its intent. The photo hadn't been sent randomly. It wasn't a memory. It was a warning, a whisper that something had not ended, that something was still happening. Riven lifted his head as Lucan stepped away from the desk. That look, quiet, watchful, but anchored to every movement, made Lucan feel like the dog saw the dark storm in him before he could name it. He sank to the floor beside Riven. No words, no questions. He turned the photo face down on the wood, then rested his hand on Riven's head, the head of a dog who had once led something far bigger than either of them fully understood. They weren't abandoned, Lucan whispered, not as a theory, but a promise. They were chosen never to return. In the nights that followed, when the wind howled through the pines, when the distant echoes of thunder rolled like artificial gunfire from the western range, military simulation exercises long since decommissioned, Lucan didn't sleep. He checked the locks, checked the cameras. He made 3 copies of the photo, each hidden in a separate location. Not because he feared discovery, but because he knew. This wasn't over. The photo wasn't an ending, it was an opening line, and the caption printed beneath it, cold, sharp, unassuming, was not a description. It was a declaration from a hand that was still alive, still watching, still guarding something the world wasn't meant to see. Lucan didn't know who had sent it, didn't know the purpose. But he knew this. People don't hide things unless those things once bled. And if truth was an arrow, then he was ready to take it, so long as when it landed, it pierced no one else but him. That night, Gale did not tremble. Blitz slept deeply. Orin breathed evenly. Naira curled against Riven like she had always belonged there. Lucan didn't light a lamp. He opened the back door instead, letting moonlight spill across the floorboards in quiet, silver waves, as if offering a path for every nightmare to find its way out. And in that moment, staring once more at the photograph, the edges soft now not from time but from the weight of memory pressing into pulp, he heard something. Not words, not a voice, just a presence that threaded through the forest, slipped past the doorframe, and exhaled beside the fire. It was so clear, so undeniable that his throat clenched before he could speak. Someone was still watching, and still waiting for him to step into the dark. He stayed seated on the back porch for a long time after that, eyes tracing the way moonlight glossed the grass in restless patches, one hand still gripping the photo that now curled slightly at the corners. Not from age, but because something within him had begun to bend, to blur, to change. The GPS numbers spun in his head like an old cipher, too deliberate to ignore, too damaged to trust. Coordinates that seemed to test the resolve of anyone who dared look at them too long. He didn't ask why, because the moment he chose to save them, he had forfeited the luxury of walking away. What remained now was a single question. Where does this go? And to find out, he would need to start again, from the map. He cleared a corner of his old workbench, long buried in dust and time. Then unfolded topographic charts, high-altitude surveillance prints, and blurred, half-legible documents, copies of field reports he'd archived from his joint operations days. None of it lined up. No civilian map matched the terrain. No military atlas registered the layout. Even satellite databases came up blank. Except for one detail. A black triangle. Faint, artificially smoothed, pixelated by an algorithm designed not to blur, but to erase. It was the kind of digital redaction used only in zones where visibility was forbidden. Places marked restricted display, either under federal blackout or buried in military-industrial contracts with too many zeros and too many secrets. Lucan leaned closer. And that's when he knew. He wasn't chasing shadows. He was looking at the place they were cast from. The coordinates led to a dense stretch of forest in the southern reaches of Chiapas, a border region in Mexico once recorded as a hotbed for arms trafficking. Yet since 2018, it had all but disappeared from media coverage, as if every sound from that place had been swallowed into an invisible vacuum where even echoes refused to return. Lucan combed through every layer of military operation licenses, scanned every leaked line from veteran forums, traced the faintest remnants of private contractor footprints, and at last he found it. Axiom Division. A name that sounded more like an algorithm than an entity, cold and stripped of humanity. Yet it echoed again and again across foreign arms contracts, defense budget footnotes shrouded in vague classifications, and nameless investment packages coursing through the opaque arteries of the off-grid military tech industry. Once, Axiom had been the biotech wing of the Nurex research conglomerate, pioneers in neural signal transmission devices, but sometime in 2014, it was quietly sold to an anonymous defense fund, and from that moment on, it vanished from the eyes and tongues of the public as though it had never existed. Until that photograph surfaced. Lucan pulled up a schematic, one he had kept since his time stationed at Al Udeid, a leaked blueprint of a high-level military animal training facility. The kennel systems were embedded deep underground, corridors sloped downward, bathed in perpetual darkness and silence, walls lined with acoustic-dampening rubber. The animals were trained in complete sensory deprivation, no light, no sound, and most crucially, no emotional tether. Some handwritten annotation still clung to the lower margin: erase empathic response. Optimize predatory instinct. Eliminate fear via the surgical extraction of affection. Lucan exhaled, the breath too heavy to be relief. He looked down at the floor, where Riven slept, head resting gently across Orin's leg, where Blitz curled into himself, still clutching a half-chewed strip of wood between his teeth, where Gale lay near the door, not in deep sleep but no longer trembling, and where Naira had buried her face into the rug, her pose so peaceful it made him almost believe none of it was real. And it was because of that peace, that impossible, fragile peace, that he knew he could no longer pretend. He turned back to the screen, eyes fixed on the name now seared into the forefront of his mind. Axiom Division. A corporation that never made the news, a system with no spokesperson, a network without a headquarters, yet always behind the things no one wanted to see. And it was there, if what the photo revealed was true, that Project Nocturnal Bond had been born. 3 days later, Lucan received confirmation from an old friend in intelligence, long since retired to the silence of the Canadian North, but still holding the keys to certain encrypted military archives known only to those who had once walked through the unspoken corridors of black tier programs. The message came brief, reduced to a single sentence. Axiom backed at least 3 experimental war animal training projects between 2012 and 2021. The last, Nocturnal Bond, internally terminated in 2022 due to unexpected errors from uncontrolled attachment. Lucan froze. The words detonated quietly inside his skull. Errors from attachment. And then he understood. What they had called an error was exactly what had made them living beings. Not tools, not weapons, but souls, capable of love. That night, as he lit the oil lamp on the back porch, the one he used to leave burning for them, for the first time, Lucan realized something he had never named before. That light wasn't just to guide them home. It was there so he wouldn't lose his way. Once he stepped fully into the map of darkness now forming before him, a map that finally had shape and name and coordinates and players and purpose. Only one question remained. Would he have the courage to enter, knowing he might not come back out? Lucan had never been a man to place faith in things not held in his hands. But sometimes, truth doesn't arrive through files or footnotes. It comes through a person, carrying it like a wound too long hidden beneath the skin. That person's name was Elian Rowe, once a senior biotechnical specialist in neurobehavioral support systems for animal trial programs under Axiom Division. He didn't come forward. He didn't cry out. He simply left a coded fragment buried in an obscure foreign veterans forum, one accessible only to those who had once heard of Operation Echogate, and could pass its security prompt. Lucan saw the code. He cracked it and sent back just a single line. "They're still alive." 4 hours later, a reply arrived. No subject, no signature, no link. Only an audio file. A man's voice, hoarse, choked, dry as if it had been strangled by years of silence. Elian had been waiting for someone to ask. And Lucan was the first to come far enough to listen. The project was called Nocturnal Bond, initial phase, late 2017. Objective: create biologically tactical units capable of operating in low-visibility environments, requiring no command signals, showing no emotional reactions, particularly suited for nocturnal infiltration missions, with maximum lethality and zero traceability upon completion. Weapons that didn't wear uniforms, that couldn't be called soldiers, that required no signature, just the instinct to kill. Lucan sat still at the desk, the wind outside rustling through the treetops like whispers over a battlefield. But in his ears, there was only that voice, the solitary, confessional cadence of a man speaking into a void. They were separated at 5 weeks old. No human contact, no names, no cooing, no laughter. Every gentle reaction was labeled a mistake. Every sign of empathy, flagged as a system error. They were praised only when silent, when unflinching, when they showed no hesitation between a command and blood. They were trained to live like darkness, no sound, no reflection, no trace. Elian paused, and in the silence that followed, his breath came through, not as air, but as a knife sliding across the heart. "I didn't think they'd remember." One night, the largest, designation 09-Delta, stepped between the technician and another dog, 09-Echo, when the behavioral control serum was administered. They bit back, not to kill, to protect. And that was the most catastrophic failure in the psychological architecture we thought we had perfected. Lucan froze. He knew the name. Delta. He had seen it, in the way Riven kept watch through the night, in the way his eyes followed every subtle shift in the others, in the way he stood, not ahead, not behind, but exactly where he needed to be, like a silent wall against chaos. Riven was Delta, and the names Lucan had given them. They weren't random. They weren't chosen unconsciously. They were fragments, pulled back from the ashes of what the world had tried to burn away. Elian's voice continued. "The project didn't fail, technically. They were perfect, but they chose not to kill. They refused the final test. They tucked their ears when a child cried. They returned to each other after every forced separation. And on the last day, when the handle it order was issued, they didn't run. They lay down, touching each other, heads resting on backs, eyes open, as if to say, if we're to disappear, then let it be together." Lucan didn't know when the tears began. He only knew that each detail Elian described was a reflection of nights he'd spent beside the dogs he once thought were just victims. But now he understood. They hadn't merely survived. They had refused to become what humans tried to forge them into. And in that refusal, they had become the first free beings in a world built for control. At the end of the recording, Elian said something else. Software uneven, like it had been swallowed 100 times before finally being spoken aloud. If you have them, don't try to fix them, because that flaw is the most beautiful thing they still carry. Lucan removed the headset, fists clenched, heart pounding. He looked across the room. Nira dozed near the pile of blankets, Blitz curled tightly against Oren's back. Gale rested near the window, eyes unmoving, watching moonlight filter through the glass. And Riven was still at the door, watching, guarding. No command had placed him there. No cue had instructed him. It was instinct, something that lived deeper than genetics, farther than any conditioning could reach. It was born of something Axiom could never program: emotion. Lucan stood, took a pen, and wrote the first words on the cover of a notebook he had once meant to use as a log for rescue efforts. Nocturnal Bond, not a project, but a name, true and earned, of souls who had once chosen not to become monsters, and for that were worthy of being called family. And family, if it could begin anywhere, began for them in the one act most forbidden in all tactical training: love. On day 73, inside the training compound, a trial labeled Live Combat Phase 2 was enacted. Each dog was confined to a separate cell. Steel walls, soundproofed, cold metal floors, rations halved, water only dispensed upon command completion. At the center of the yard was an iron ring. That day, Blitz was the first one pushed in. Overhead, through a speaker that held no humanity, no tone, came only 3 words, repeated, again and again: advance, attack. Advance, attack. Advance, attack. Another dog was released into the ring, Gale, not as a partner, but as an opponent. The test wasn't about skill, it was about whether instinct could be severed from memory, whether one would strike first when the threat was family. Blitz blinked, confused. Gale stood frozen. No handler held a leash. No human gaze offered guidance. Only the pressure of metal grinding and the programmed isolation of captivity. Blitz took one hesitant step. Gale retreated half a pace. No growls, no snarls, no lunge. The operator pressed a low-frequency sound pulse, one designed to overstimulate neural pathways, to provoke violence. The machines recorded tension, but no attack. Only this. Blitz paused, trembling, and Gale stepped forward, not to strike, but to shield. The system flagged an error. Lights blinked, reports flickered onto the console. Empathy index exceeds threshold. Recommend reclassification, Delta Echo to termination sector. The night before processing, all lights were cut from Corridor 4, the wing where the 5 were held, awaiting transfer. Destination marked Northern Zone, Anti-Piracy Simulation Range. But in truth, the manifest led nowhere. A ghost route. A container without return. The transport ship ran for 8 hours, no checks, no questions. When the container was dropped into the ocean, no one turned around. No one asked why, in the final surveillance footage, not one of them resisted. Because they hadn't chosen fear. They had chosen each other. Lucan read the transcript again, hands trembling. The oil lamp flickered in the corner. Riven lay not far, eyes closed but ears still alert toward the porch. Gale and Blitz touched heads in their sleep. Oren had curled a paw just enough to shelter Nira's muzzle. A makeshift shelter built not from walls, but from stillness and shared breath. None of them had known, in that moment, that they'd been marked for erasure. They had only known one truth, something no machine could quantify. That love, even when buried beneath layers of programming and pain, remains the deepest root of any living soul. And if they had to vanish, then let that vanishing be a memory carved into time. We once loved. We were once loved. We chose love instead of violence. But not everyone wants that memory to live. Not everyone believes love belongs on the battlefield. And now, etched into the shadows of Lucan's wall, appeared the name of the man who once believed victory required no soul. Draven Call, Lucan sat in silence before the dossier Elian had just sent. Encrypted under a triple-layer protocol, its traces blurred by an algorithm once reserved solely for deep black operations, The kind of missions that never bore an official designation, that recorded no fatalities, that sent no letters of condolence, because their existence was never meant to be acknowledged at all. The first file contained only a line of text. Supreme Tactical Commander, Operation Radiant Fall. Responsible for the design of autonomous biological infiltration units. Codename, Decall. Lucan didn't need to read more, because there had only ever been one man who used that style of designation. And only one man who had once told him, on a freezing night in the hills of Harrier back in 2013, when their unit had just lost 3 soldiers in a miscalculated ambush. Emotion is a flaw. What survives on the battlefield is efficiency. Win first, apologize later, better than dying from hesitation. Draven Call, the man with a face so devoid of warmth that even the pain of those beneath his command was treated as numerical variance, had once been Lucan's direct commander. It was Call who had taught him how to pull the trigger before confirming whether the figure in his scope was truly an enemy. It was Call who had instilled into their unit what he called absolute survival thinking. And now, it was Call again, standing behind Axiom Division. Lucan reached for an old photograph tucked deep inside his notebook. It was one of the rare ones he had kept, not because anyone in the image was worth remembering, but because the angle, the lens, had captured something that should never have been there. An expression. Among the rows of gray uniforms, metal helmets, and southern Kandahar's red sands, the eyes of Draven Call stared not at the camera, not at any soldier, not at anything specific, just off to the side, as if fixed on a place where conscience had long since been shelved and forgotten. Lucan remembered, back in Delta 6, when a mine detection dog named Skull was wounded during a mission, how it screamed under the sandstorm winds, and how the team stopped. Some knelt beside it, some blocked the wind. One soldier emptied his water ration to clean the wound. But one man, Call, remained still, then turned away. Not angry, not disturbed, just indifferent. The next day, Skull was gone. No medical report, no debrief. Only a single entry on the revised assignment board. Unit 09 has been replaced. No retention required. Now all the pieces returned, black-winged, circling in Lucan's mind like crows stirred from the edges of memory. The training system built to erase emotion. The combat tests pitched between members of the same pack. The severance from human language, from naming, from light. And finally, the container. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been bureaucratic oversight. It had been intentional. A designed disposal, cold, clinical, approved and signed by the very man who once taught him that love was the reason wars were lost. Lucan rose, not from rage, but because he felt cold, not the kind that comes from the night air, but the kind that seeps straight into the heart when you finally realize the one responsible for everything the souls sleeping beside him had endured was the same man who once placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Good work, Lucan. You shoot like a man with no heart." Outside, in the yard, Riven had stood up. No sound, no warning in the eyes, just an instinct, so deep, so ancient that Lucan knew without being told. They remembered too. They didn't need names. But they knew who the darkness was that had created them. Lucan knelt down, rested a hand on Riven's back. Just a light press. A message without voice. A pact without blood. "I know who he is. And if he's still watching, then he should know. We have names now, and we're not his anymore." That night's sky bore no moon. Only stars, scattered and cold, sharp as needles stitching old wounds across the skin of memory. Lucan stepped back inside, opened the notebook, turned the page, and drew a circle. Inside it, no cages, no chains, only 5 small figures, curled close, back to back, just as they once had defied every line of code ever written to contain them. And beneath it, outside the circle, he wrote a name, no capitalization, no bold type, just silence, like a warning whispered through fog. Draven Call, the man who created darkness, and who would soon be forced to witness the light he had once tried to extinguish. Lucan closed the notebook at 3:17 a.m. The wind through the forest slipped beneath the eaves, brushing loose leaves against one another with the sound of secrets not yet spoken, but drawing near. He didn't sleep. Not because of insomnia, but because instinct, that sixth sense honed through every bullet not taken, was telling him, something isn't right. Gale was the first to rise. No growl, no bark, only a quiet halt at the door, ears pricked forward, one paw sliding back, slow and deliberate, as if waiting for an invisible presence to cross a threshold never meant to be breached. Blitz, half asleep, lifted his head. Riven didn't move, but his eyes opened. Not sharply, not directly. They moved through the corners of the room, scanning breath by breath, seeking not danger, but the absence of familiarity. Lucan rose. He didn't reach for a flashlight. In the grainy dark of the cabin, he walked with no haste. Not to check, but to confirm. Confirm that the thing which had trailed them for so long was no longer outside. It had come in. The back door, which led to the porch, hung slightly ajar. No wind, no creaking hinge, just metal worked loose, carefully, intentionally, precisely enough to allow a dark-clothed figure to slip in and leave without a trace, except for the message. Carved into the wooden wall beside the stove, right where the oil lamp's light never quite reached, was a line etched by something sharp. Not scratched, not shaken, each groove clean, cold, and deliberate, cut by a hand that had once slit throats without hesitation. Return them. Next time, no warning. Lucan stood still. He didn't shake, but his breath was uneven, not from fear, but from a fury pressed tight beneath the weight of reason. He reached out and touched the grooves. No splinters, no haste, no blood left behind. Whoever did this had time, confidence, control. And that was the declaration of war. He turned. Riven was already beside him, eyes fixed on the door. Neera stepped down from the loft, her steps silent. Gale turned his head toward the tree line. Blitz pressed his ear to the floorboards. Oren stood at the gap between the living area and the sleeping quarters. No commands, no signals. They knew, because they had heard it too, because they remembered that breath. Lucan locked the door, not with a bolt, but by wrapping 3 loops of copper wire around the handle. Then he reached into the hearth, pulled char from the coals, and began drawing symbols around the frame. Old warning circles, passed down by Ethiopian soldiers who believed that interlocking loops could disorient anything without a soul. Not out of superstition, but to send a message. I no longer defend with guns, I defend with memory, and if you return, you'll have to walk through everything we survived. Before dawn, Lucan stepped into the backyard, dew still clinging to the grass. He scanned the path. No prints, no broken twigs, just a subtle indent in the soil near the old flower bed. A black bead, tactical grade, the kind used to fasten onto high-grade combat gloves, gleamed faintly in the grass. He picked it up, placed it into a wooden box beside the notebook. And beneath the name, Draven Call, he wrote, "They don't just know who we're protecting. They know who we've become." That night, as the dogs slept together, the formation shifted. For the first time, Gale faced the door instead of turning away. Blitz lay pressed against Riven, not for warmth, but for grounding. Naira didn't curl inward. She stretched one leg out, partially covering Oren's side. And Oren, always the sentinel close to the floor, lifted his head toward Lucan, as if asking, "What now?" Lucan didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a single bullet he'd kept since his last deployment, a lead-core armor-piercing round. Not to fire, but to remind himself, if they come again, it won't be a warning, and if the darkness wants to reclaim what it once forged, then it will have to walk through what the light has chosen to protect. The morning began like any other, except for one truth. Nothing was ordinary anymore. Lucan was awake before the birds. No coffee, no radio, only paper and pen. He drew the layout of the cabin. Every entrance, every draft, every blind spot. Marked. Not as a home, but as a body. One that had to be defended, not with walls, but with intention. He didn't load his weapons, didn't check traps, didn't plant mines. Because this wasn't a battlefield. This was a sanctuary. And it needed to stay one. He sawed 2 new beams to reinforce the front door, mounted 3 passive infrared thermal sensors, disguised beneath old wind chimes along the porch's edge. Under the kitchen crawl space, he cleared a path, lining it with pine needles and breathable soil. It wasn't called an escape route. It was a breath space, a place where, if needed, life could find a slit in the dark wide enough to slip through. Lucan didn't teach them to attack, didn't bark commands, didn't set targets. He simply opened the back door, stepped out into the morning mist, knelt on the earth, and tapped the ground softly, then looked up at them. "We are not weapons. We don't prove worth through tears or blood. We only need to live, and let each other live." Riven stepped forward first, not bowing, not growling, just placed one paw on Lucan's forearm. Steady, deliberate. One by one. Naira, Blitz, Gale, Oren followed. No command, no line formation. They stood in a circle, back to back, eyes outward, fur brushing, breath shared. Lucan saw it clearly now. They didn't need to be trained to fight. They just needed permission to trust what had always been in them, that primal, silenced instinct. And this time, no one would have the power to take it away. He began training Blitz to respond to high-frequency tones, not to strike, but to pull the others toward shelter. He showed Gale how to trace unfamiliar metals, not to disable, but to know when danger had already stepped too close. He taught Oren how to brace himself against the door, not as a sentry meant to bar the way, but as a living threshold, a silent gate capable of shifting, yielding, or holding, depending on what the moment demanded. He entrusted Naira with the eyes of the pack, not because she was swift, but because she trusted her instincts more deeply than she ever trusted herself. And sometimes that was exactly what survival required. As for Riven, he taught him nothing, because Riven, from the very beginning to this very breath, had always been the night's sentinel. Never appointed, never asked, yet always awake. Every evening, Lucan walked the perimeter, checked every bolt, every door hinge, every link in the fence. Not out of fear, but to ensure he would never be caught unaware. Because he knew what once entered without leaving a trace could always return. But this time, they wouldn't find a cabin tucked away and exposed in the forest. They would find a heart wrapped in will. A place where beings once labeled tools had chosen to defend not with programming, but with instinct and love. Night fell. Lucan did not turn off the porch light, not to illuminate the dark, but to send a message. "I know you're watching, but I'm watching back." Gale slept beside the door. Oren lay across the exit. Blitz rested his head on Riven's leg. And Naira, for the first time, didn't curl into a corner but stretched out in the center of the floor, right where the moonlight poured in through the cracked roof, as if to say, without a sound, she was done hiding. Lucan sat on the threshold, hand resting on the worn handle of an old knife. He didn't draw it. He didn't conceal it. He simply held it, like one holds a final breath, listening for the shift in the air. Before going to sleep, he scribbled a single line into the notebook. They don't need to become strong. They only need to be themselves. And that already is a strength no system can erase. The wind whispered through the roof slats. Not cold, but just enough to make Lucan's shoulders flinch. A subtle reflex passed down from every moment his body had once braced for pain he couldn't see coming. He lay on his side, left hand resting gently on Riven's back, still breathing steadily, no sudden twitches, no sharp flinches. Not like a creature guarding against noise, but like someone holding a quiet space inside themselves, for both of them. Lucan didn't turn on the light, didn't switch on the radio. He simply stared upward at the ceiling where the old paint peeled, where knots in the timber had shrunk with time, forming a map with no names, like the life he had once lived, drawn by someone else's hand, confined by choices that had never been his to make. And now, for the first time, he was choosing, not just the path, but the reason to take it. Riven shifted slightly. Lucan didn't move. Not out of fear of waking him, but because he needed to keep that rhythm close, needed that breath to speak for him. A reply to the question no one had asked all day. They had sent warnings. They had carved messages into walls. They had stood just beyond the edge of the property, waiting, perhaps, for a decision. Lucan knew. No one enters a fight like this with logic, and no one walks away with a whole heart. But he also knew there was one truth that made all the pain worth enduring. No one has the right to call them property again. No one. Not the government, not the military, not even me. He turned toward Riven, laying his head a little closer. Part habit, part vow. One not spoken aloud, but carved in the marrow of his being. I didn't pull you from the rust so you could be used again. I didn't lift you out of that box just to hand you back to the place that trained you to die without making a sound. I didn't look into those eyes, just to watch them be dimmed once more under the weight of something called a higher order. The ceiling remained still. The wind stirred the trees outside. The roof creaked gently. Gale shifted, her nose brushing against Oren's shoulder. Blitz curled tighter beneath the table, his eyes still cracked open just enough to see. Nira lay pressed against the door, same as she had each night for a week, not out of fear, but to be the first line if anything came. And in that silence, Lucan realized, none of them were dogs. They were children, not by blood, but by something deeper, by choice. I chose not to let you be forgotten, and you chose to trust me when nothing in this world gave you a reason to. There were moments he had asked himself, why didn't he turn them in? Why didn't he respond to the warnings? Why not hand them over to a shelter, a program, a non-military zone? But then, all it took was hearing Riven breathe. All it took was seeing Naira flinch when a helicopter passed overhead. All it took was the look in Blitz's eyes every time someone moved beyond the fence. Because no one was better suited to protect them than a man who had once known what it meant to be used like a tool, then discarded once his function ran out. Lucan sat up just before dawn. He woke no one. He turned on no lights. He wrote one final line in the notebook, not for himself, but for anyone who might one day find it, amid the rubble or beneath the ash. I was once a soldier. I once followed orders. I once believed loyalty was the highest truth. But then I learned there is something higher still, the courage to choose, even when you know you won't be forgiven. He taught Oren how to brace himself against the door, not as a sentry meant to bar the way, but as a living threshold, a silent gate capable of shifting, yielding, or holding, depending on what the moment demanded. He entrusted Naira with the eyes of the pack, not because she was swift, but because she trusted her instincts more deeply than she ever trusted herself. And sometimes that was exactly what survival required. As for Riven, he taught him nothing. Because Riven, from the very beginning to this very breath, had always been the night's sentinel. Never appointed, never asked, yet always awake. Every evening, Lucan walked the perimeter, checked every bolt, every door hinge, every link in the fence. Not out of fear, but to ensure he would never be caught unaware. Because he knew. What once entered without leaving a trace could always return. But this time, they wouldn't find a cabin tucked away and exposed in the forest. They would find a heart wrapped in will. A place where beings once labeled tools had chosen to defend not with programming, but with instinct and love. Night fell. Lucan did not turn off the porch light, not to illuminate the dark, but to send a message. I know you're watching, but I'm watching back. Gale slept beside the door. Oren lay across the exit. Blitz rested his head on Riven's leg. And Nira, for the first time, didn't curl into a corner but stretched out in the center of the floor, right where the moonlight poured in through the cracked roof, as if to say, without a sound, she was done hiding. Lucan sat on the threshold, hand resting on the worn handle of an old knife. He didn't draw it. He didn't conceal it. He simply held it, like one holds a final breath, listening for the shift in the air. Before going to sleep, he scribbled a single line into the notebook. They don't need to become strong. They only need to be themselves, and that, already, is a strength no system can erase. The wind whispered through the roof slats, not cold, but just enough to make Lucan's shoulders flinch, a subtle reflex passed down from every moment his body had once braced for pain he couldn't see coming. He lay on his side, left hand resting gently on Riven's back, still breathing steadily, no sudden twitches, no sharp flinches. Not like a creature guarding against noise, but like someone holding a quiet space inside themselves, for both of them. Lucan didn't turn on the light, didn't switch on the radio. He simply stared upward at the ceiling where the old paint peeled, where knots in the timber had shrunk with time, forming a map with no names, like the life he had once lived, drawn by someone else's hand, confined by choices that had never been his to make. And now, for the first time, he was choosing. Not just the path, but the reason to take it. Riven shifted slightly. Lucan didn't move, not out of fear of waking him, but because he needed to keep that rhythm close, needed that breath to speak for him. A reply to the question no one had asked all day. They had sent warnings. They had carved messages into walls. They had stood just beyond the edge of the property, waiting, perhaps, for a decision. Lucan knew. No one enters a fight like this with logic, and no one walks away with a whole heart. But he also knew there was one truth that made all the pain worth enduring. No one has the right to call them property again. No one. Not the government, not the military, not even me. He turned toward Riven, laying his head a little closer. Part habit, part vow. One not spoken aloud, but carved in the marrow of his being. I didn't pull you from the rust so you could be used again. I didn't lift you out of that box just to hand you back to the place that trained you to die without making a sound. I didn't look into those eyes, just to watch them be dimmed once more, under the weight of something called a higher order. The ceiling remained still. The wind stirred the trees outside. The roof creaked gently. Gale shifted, her nose brushing against Oren's shoulder. Blitz curled tighter beneath the table. His eyes still cracked open, just enough to see. Naira lay pressed against the door, same as she had each night for a week, not out of fear, but to be the first line if anything came. And in that silence, Lucan realized, none of them were dogs. They were children, not by blood, but by something deeper, by choice. I chose not to let you be forgotten, and you chose to trust me when nothing in this world gave you a reason to. There were moments he had asked himself, why didn't he turn them in? Why didn't he respond to the warnings? Why not hand them over to a shelter, a program, a non-military zone? But then, all it took was hearing Riven breathe. All it took was seeing Naira flinch when a helicopter passed overhead. All it took was the look in Blitz's eyes every time someone moved beyond the fence, because no one was better suited to protect them than a man who had once known what it meant to be used like a tool, then discarded once his function ran out. Lucan sat up just before dawn. He woke no one. He turned on no lights. He wrote one final line in the notebook, not for himself, but for anyone who might one day find it, amid the rubble or beneath the ash. I was once a soldier. I once followed orders. I once believed loyalty was the highest truth. But then I learned there is something higher still, the courage to choose, even when you know you won't be forgiven. When Lucan closed the notebook, Riven lifted his head and touched his nose gently to the inside of Lucan's wrist. No lick, no whimper, just a touch, barely there, like a quiet thank you that no being ever trained to suppress emotion could have uttered aloud. Lucan smiled. Not with sound. Just closed his eyes, leaned back, and whispered, "Sleep, son. Tomorrow. We've still got work to do." But when morning arrived, he wasn't the man who rose to patch a rusted roof, refill Blitz's water bowl, or carefully brush the burrs from between Oren's toes after their run. He woke with something else in his hand. A file, no envelope, no title. Just a flash drive clipped to a folded sheet of paper. One sentence. If you stay silent, they won't be the last. The data wasn't encrypted like before, almost as if the sender wanted him to see it, wanted him to know, wanted him incapable of turning away. A cascade of satellite images began to appear. Not Arlo, not the coast where the container had once floated, but a remote stretch buried deep in the Andes, abandoned years ago due to earthquakes, now revitalized under the pretext of agricultural development. But infrared imaging doesn't lie. Beneath the soil, a network of piping, steel kennels, isolated corridors, cages, each just large enough for a single body, each fitted with a tracking chip, each equipped with sleep monitoring sensors. Lucan hadn't yet clicked to change the view when the video launched itself. No pause, no controls, just a single playback. Project Nocturnal Bond did not fail. It is being restructured. Emotion can now be suppressed via wave interference. Willpower can be rewritten by modulating serotonin levels. The old has been discarded. The new is en route. A man's voice, neutral, accentless, but carrying the chilling precision of someone who viewed living creatures as raw materials to be upgraded. Lucan sat frozen, his hand slipping from the mouse, his eyes locked on the final line, engraved in bold at the bottom of the document. Initial deployment, 128 units. Each unit equals one subject, no names, no original tags. He closed the laptop, slowly, carefully, as if he were only shutting a book. No shouting, no slamming fists, no scream, just silence, and his hand on Riven's back, still warm beside him, still drowsy. And then a whisper, so low it barely passed through breath. "No, not again." He understood now. The choice was no longer between stillness and movement, because silence was complicity, and speaking out was sacrifice. If he exposed the truth, if he released the files, if he spoke, wrote, testified, the world would see, the headlines would run, human rights groups would rally, lawyers, investigations, global pressure, Axiom Division would be forced to retreat. But at what cost? They would come for him, not with warnings, but with action. They would not misstep. They would not miss. They would not stop, until the dogs beside him were erased not as bodies, but as threats to a model that could not tolerate soul. He looked toward the door. Naira lay near it, not fully awake, but her ears twitched, subtle, instinctual, already sensing that something within the man beside her had shifted. Blitz stirred, raised his head. No confusion, no fear. Just waiting. Gale was already awake. Orin lay still, but not unaware, giving space for thought, and Riven hadn't moved, but his eyes were open. Staring, unblinking, straight at Lucan, as if asking, "Decide. We don't run. But we need to know. Are you willing to lose us, to save the ones who don't even have names yet?" Lucan turned his face away, not from guilt, but because the greatest pain always arrives when one must choose between what's right and what can never be undone. He stepped onto the porch. The morning wind didn't stir. The sky didn't shift. Everything was frozen, caught in the stillness that only comes before something is about to break. He reached beneath the bench, drew out a small stack of blank pages, and wrote the title, "Testimony, not for the law, but for the lives that can never write their own." Then, beneath it, "My name is Lucan Thorne, and I choose silence no longer." No one prompted him. No one asked. No promise of safety. No guarantee they'd survive. But if a pack of dogs, once taught that emotion was a flaw, could still curl into one another at night, could still share their food, could still lift their heads to look into the eyes of a man who once vowed never to love again, then how could he, now, turn away, just because love was fragile? Lucan sat still before the darkened screen, fingers resting lightly on the page he had just signed. No trembling, no hesitation, just one truth echoing like a pulse. From this point forward, there is no return. Outside, the night in Arlo held no wind, no snapping branches, no owls, just that unnatural silence, the kind that makes even the trees feel like they're holding their breath. At exactly 003, the phone rang. No name, no number. Just one phrase blinking on the screen. Unknown origin. Lucan wasn't surprised. He answered. Didn't put it on speaker, didn't speak first. And on the other end, as if they too understood the rules of this silence, no one said a word. The voice came through, not rushed, not drawn out, just cold enough to leave a trace like ice across the spine. So in the end, you still chose instinct over system. I once believed you understood. What makes humanity win isn't compassion, but the ability to erase it. Lucan didn't answer. He leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting towards the floor where Riven lay pressed close, his gaze steady, unwavering, fixed forward like a compass that no longer needed calibration. The voice continued. You're a soldier. You were trained to understand. Emotion is the breakdown of strategy. And me, I don't need someone who understands me. I need someone who obeys. And you chose wrong. Lucan raised a hand to his temple, closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, as though he had just laid to rest a memory too heavy to carry through the night. Then he spoke, not interrupting, not trembling, not unsure. "The dogs I saved? Did you ever call any of them by name?" Silence crackled for a few seconds. Then the reply came, as if the question had been absurd to begin with. "I addressed them by function. Unit 04 was pursuit. Unit 07, silent elimination. Unit 09 had high-speed approach metrics, weak under high-noise environments." Lucan nodded. Not in agreement, but in confirmation. "Then that's why you'll never understand why I said no. Because I didn't save units. I saved Gale, I saved Blitz, I saved Naira, I saved Orin, and I saved Riven, the first one who chose to trust me, with no reason required." The voice on the other end shifted. Not anger, not frustration, but a kind of momentary inconvenience, as if suddenly forced to recognize something that disrupted the flow of command. "They don't belong to you, Lucan. They are outcomes, investments, tools I paid to train, to code, to create. You're a relic. I have the whole system, and they are my assets." Lucan let out a soft laugh. Not a mocking one, but the kind of laugh worn by someone who once believed in the sanctity of power, only to watch it collapse in the dirt of Afghanistan, where no briefing, no rank, no order could bring back the body breathing beside you. Then he answered, slowly, every word honed like steel. "I used to belong to the system. I wore the uniform. I stood straight in strategic meetings. I listened to men like you recite doctrines about national security and the necessity of control. But there's one thing you can't control, one thing that ruins your math, the reason a starving, shocked, caged animal still licks the hand that first gives it water." Silence. Then a final line came through. Not screamed, not threatened, just clean and sharp, like a blade. "If you won't return them, I'll come take them." The line went dead. No beep. No goodbye. Lucan set the phone down, not clenched, not thrown, just placed it there, steady. He didn't turn toward Riven. He didn't need to. Riven was already on his feet. Blitz had raised his head. Naira was stepping onto the porch. Gale nudged Orin's shoulder, rousing him. No names had been called, but they had all heard. Lucan stepped down the porch, eyes sweeping across the tree line where darkness thickened just beyond the fence. The wind had shifted. Gone was the familiar scent of Arlo's pine, replaced by something foreign, not quite human, not quite animal. An odor born from sealed armories and unmarked crates, cold metal, damp nylon, and sweat masked by military-grade deodorants. Blitz left his post. No growl, no bark, just a slow, silent move toward the far corner of the fence, near the old corn patch, where Lucan had buried a narrow strip of wire to detect movement. The sound it made was barely there, just a faint click, softer than breath. But it rang like a bell in the instincts of creatures who had once been taught to forget their instincts. Orin turned, moving to block the back entrance. He didn't move again. Didn't need to. He stood, silent, unmoving, a wall of flesh and will. Gale stepped into the dark, like a shadow peeling away from its source. No sound, no breath, only purpose. Lucan moved back inside, didn't turn on the light. Riven followed, not to protect, but to remind him. From this point forward, every step was taken together. No one ahead, no one left behind. The first sound came at 1:41 a.m. Not a door, not shattered glass, but an inhale. Sharp, rushed, the startled breath of someone who realized they'd been spotted too soon. And in that instant, Blitz launched. No hesitation, no signal. His speed wasn't meant to strike. It was meant to reveal, and in 1.7 seconds, a dull thud hit the soil, a body fell, Gale followed. No roar, no snarl, just a silent blur. Then a snap of teeth sinking deep. Not into the throat, but into the wrist. The one holding the weapon. Metal clattered to the ground. A breath caught. Then silence. Lucan opened the side door, red flashlight on diffused beam, just enough to see two bodies lying still, pulse intact. Not dead. Alive. To remember that this was not a training ground. This was home. The static crackle of a radio came from one man's headset. Side path compromised. North team non-responsive. K-unit neutralized. East withdrawing. Repeat, withdraw. Lucan's hand brushed the holster. But he didn't draw. He didn't need to. Because what echoed through those comms wasn't gunfire. It was silence. The silence of living souls once trained not to love, now fighting because they loved. But one attacker didn't withdraw. One crawled, not upright, low, through the dry trench, like a shadow with purpose. Naira saw him first. She didn't bark. She raised a paw, tapped the door, 3 times. Lucan understood. He lit the porch light, switched it to steady amber. Not to see, but to signal. Target entering 6-meter range. Riven stepped forward to the fence line, stood still, unmoving. The intruder didn't know he'd been seen 6 minutes earlier. Didn't know Naira was leading him. Didn't know the darkest corner was where dogs saw clearest. Didn't know Gale waited just beyond the dew-pressed grass, still as the night. The man rose, knife in hand, stepped toward the porch. Before he reached the steps, Gale struck. A glide, a bite to the knee, a throw to the ground. Riven was there before the blade could rise, clamped the wrist. No pressure, just a hold. Lucan stepped forward, gun still holstered, bent, took the radio from the intruder's belt. Pressed transmit. This is Lucan Thorne. This is where I live. They are no longer assets. Every step you take from here is a step away from humanity. I won't say it again. The lights had been turned off, the wind had returned, and the faint scent of blood dissolved quietly into the fog. Oren resumed his place, just at the edge of the kitchen door. Naira slipped back beneath the blanket. Gale remained on the porch, as if he'd never left. Blitz curled beneath the table, his body a silent guard. And Riven rested his chin on Lucan's leg, not looking up.